Night settles over a silent plain, and in the half-light you can just make out the shape of a stone, massive, unmoving, older than memory. Wind slides across its surface like a muted hymn, and for an instant you wonder, who first lifted this monolith into place? What kind of being carved its edges so clean that even time hesitated to erode them? Somewhere below the soil lie foundations suggesting builders whose scale defies our ordinary imagination. And as the stars glimmer above, each one burning with ancient indifference, the question deepens. Were these the works of ordinary civilizations, or the fatting fingerprints of giants? Close your eyes, if you wish, and listen as the earth retells its buried story. Structures from Bashan to Baalbek echo the same silent challenge. Why do these stones know more than our oldest written records? Who walked between them when the world was young and unbroken? Tradition speaks of the Nephilim, colossal beings born of rebellion and ruin, shaping landscapes with strength that bordered on myth. But was their legacy construction or domination? A quiet breath of night lingers around the stones, as though guarding the last memories of a world on the edge of judgment. Tonight the dust lifts, the past stirs, and the giants rise again in the mind's eye. A low hush spreads over the ancient earth, a breath of wind sliding across stones far older than any kingdom ever named. In that quiet, the land remembers shapes too large for ordinary memory, impressions pressed into soil by beings whose steps carried the weight of another age. Sight the horizon long enough, and the mind begins to wonder. What kind of world existed before cities were born? What hands carved the earth before human hands learned the meaning of craft? And why do some foundations feel as though they were placed not for mortals, but before them? In Genesis 6, the text speaks in restrained thunder, mighty men of old, men of renown, hinting at a presence both physical and mythic. Yet Scripture's brevity is its own kind of echo, leaving vast spaces between syllables where questions gather like mist. Who were these beings whose reputation preceded the rise of nations? How did they come to shape the world with such force that their shadows would linger through cultures, legends, and whispered traditions across millennia? And what compelled them to build it all, when strength alone could command obedience? The earth offers no direct answer, only massive stones, fitted so tightly that even centuries of wind cannot pry them apart. Miniature kingdoms would later rise and fall around them, but the stones remain, indifferent to the ambitions of mortals. Silent foundations endure. The builders do not. Across the floodplains of early Mesopotamia, traces of oversized architecture wait beneath layers of river silt, enigmatic platforms, colossal sprawlings of masonry, and scattered monoliths that seem to belong to a race who viewed the world at a different scale. Though archaeology remains cautious, oral traditions from ancient cultures consistently speak of monuments fashioned in the days when giants walked the land. Some stories describe pre-flood cities whose structures reached so high that even storm clouds brushed their parapets. Others recall stones so vast that only beings, whose height challenged the heavens, could have moved them. Enoch tradition. Are these poetic exaggerations, or fractured memories of a world undone? The giants Nephilim occupy a paradoxical space in the human imagination. They are beings simultaneously feared and revered, symbols of both strength and spiritual ruin. Genesis frames their existence within corruption and violence, suggesting that whatever marvels they built under a shadow. Yet human memory is complicated. It remembers their terror, yes, but also their craft. Why else would so many ancient communities preserve tales of colossal foundations, as though acknowledging that before mortals mastered stone, giants had already written their own story into the bedrock? Why did these beings build? Was their architecture an act of expression, an attempt to reflect heavenly patterns their fathers once knew? Was it a display of dominance, a physical assertion of power over the newly forming world? Or was every stone a warning, a marker of what happens when strength divorces itself from obedience? Each possibility draws the imagination deeper, and deeper still when we consider that the Nephilim's spiritual corruption, rooted in defiance, may have shaped their constructions as much as their physical stature did. Could their buildings have been attempts to immortalize themselves, to inscribe their rebellion into the very landscape God had shaped? Or were their works echoes of divine architecture, distorted through ambition? Stones do not speak, but they remember pressure, weight, intention. They hold the silent testimony of hands powerful enough to lift multi-ton blocks with ease. When we encounter foundations that defy chronology, structures predating known civilizations, or showing a precision their surrounding cultures could not replicate, we are forced into a humbling tension. Either early humanity possessed forgotten techniques now lost to time hypothesis, or something walked the earth whose capacity dwarfed our own. This tension becomes the heart of the chapter. For every tradition that exalts the giants as bringers of knowledge, another condemns them as agents of ruin. For every legendary monument attributed to their strength, Scripture offers a warning that their greatness carried within it the seed of catastrophe. The past becomes a palimpsest, layers of fear, awe, and remembrance, all written atop stones that still stand. But if the giants built to endure forever, if they shaped landscapes with intention and force, if they carved their will into the earth so deeply that even the flood could not fully erase their imprint, then why do their works now lie in ruin, scattered like bones of a forgotten world? A single unanswered stone sits half buried in the dust, its edges whisper of hands no longer here. A question lingers in the silence. What broke the world they once commanded? But everything changed when the memory of the giants began colliding with the earliest human attempts to rebuild after the flood, when survivors stepped onto landscapes scarred by construction they could neither understand nor replicate. The earth they returned to was not a blank page. It was an enormous tablet already inscribed with the ambitions of beings now swept away. And so the tension sharpened. How do you live beside ruins whose very scale seems to question your existence? How do you claim a land shaped by hands your size could never imitate? And what does it mean to inherit a world haunted not by spirits, but by architecture? Travelers in ancient Mesopotamia wrote of stones that seemed older than memory, foundations so massive they dwarfed even the earliest temples. Flood-era myths, Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian, preserved faint recollections of great men from before the deluge, mighty figures whose cities were swallowed when judgment fell. While these stories differ from Genesis in theology and moral framing, their convergence is uncanny. A vanished race, a catastrophe, and remnants of buildings too immense for ordinary builders. Was this convergence coincidence, or the residue of a shared trauma echoing across cultures? Could scattered civilizations, each emerging from their own river valleys and mountain passes, all invent the same memory independently? Or were they all interpreting the same colossal debris field with different languages and worldviews? Stone does not answer, but silence often provokes deeper questions than speech. Some traditions recount giants shaping the land before mortals even knew its shape, raising terraces, carving channels, establishing boundaries that early humanity simply inherited. To a fragile post-flood population, newly vulnerable and painfully aware of scale, these ruins must have appeared like the bones of a world made by a race of titans. Whole cultures developed mythic language to interpret them. Cyclopean masonry in later eras, for example, would bear that very name because Greeks believed only one-eyed giants could have lifted such stones. This impulse, to explain the impossible by invoking the immense, echoes the same ancient instinct that preserved memories of Nephilim builders in the Near East. And beneath that instinct lies a deeper question. Is myth exaggeration or remembrance? Sometimes ruins are the oldest storytellers. Sometimes the stones speak louder than tradition. Genesis offers only a few lines, yet those lines cast enormous shadows. Mighty men of old suggests renown so widespread that it outlived the world that birthed it. But renown alone does not raise monuments. What drove the Nephilim to shape the earth with such force? Strength does not automatically produce structure. Something more deliberate must have governed their designs. Were they attempting to establish dominion over the early world, staking cosmic claims before nations even existed? Were they answering a deeper instinct inherited from their watcher lineage, a longing to mirror the heavenly realms through earthly craft non-canonical tradition? Or were their constructions desperate gestures toward immortality, efforts to defy the judgment already ripening over them? Even now, archaeologists encounter stones whose placement seems to defy the tools available to early humans. While many such anomalies may be explained through forgotten engineering or hypothesis, misinterpretation of layers, a few resist easy dismissal. Precision-cut basalt slabs, oversized platforms aligned with astronomical patterns, fragmentary walls composed of stones normally requiring entire communities to move. When early humanity stood before these structures, did they feel the same blend of awe and dread? Did they sense, long before historians and linguists attempted explanations, that they were beholding the last fingerprints of a vanished people? Human memory is remarkably resilient and remarkably selective. It preserves what terrifies, what overwhelms, what refuses to fit the scale of daily life. The giants became legends not merely because of their stature, but because their works reshaped the earth itself. Ancient people did not only remember the beings, they remembered the architecture. And architecture is a kind of witness. It testifies not only to what was built, but to who built it. Tell me your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? And yet, even with all these echoes, one puzzle remains untouched. If the Nephilim constructed with such colossal intent, why did their works ultimately crumble? Scripture suggests a moral fault line beneath their strength. Tradition speaks of violence, corruption, and pride. Could their ruins be the physical residue of spiritual collapse? Or is the ruin itself a kind of divine punctuation, an unfinished sentence ending in silence? Far on the horizon, a single monolith leans at an impossible angle, as though nudged by a hand the world no longer knows. What force brought it to its knees? And now the story tightens, for whatever the giants built, whatever marks they carved into the newborn world, would eventually collide with a verdict far greater than their strength. But before judgment fell, their achievements and their failures became part of a landscape humanity would one day inherit. Imagine early wanderers stepping into valleys where the earth rose in geometric forms unnatural to the wild terrain. Imagine them tracing their fingers along stones too immense for tribes or kingdoms to lift. What would they think of such a world? What emotions rise when the land feels haunted by architecture? And what does a newly reborn humanity conclude when standing before monuments built by hands now erased? The giants' paradox sharpened here. Beings capable of reshaping creation were incapable of mastering themselves. Their influence spread across the earth, not merely through physical dominance, but through the psychological weight of their constructions. Ruins communicate power long after power has died. Did these beings imagine that by raising impossible structures, they could assert control over a world slipping toward divine reckoning? Did they believe that height, mass, and permanence could shield them from the consequences of their corruption, as Genesis subtly implies? Or did they build compulsively, driven by an inherited echo of celestial patterns, glimpses of heavenly design filtered through rebellion and decay? Greatness without goodness becomes its own catastrophe. Even stone cannot outlast moral collapse. Archaeological enigmas, massive platforms, alignment stones, ancient megastructures whose purposes elude us, invite contemplation rather than certainty. Scholars debate whether these ruins truly reflect a forgotten advanced culture, or whether later societies simply projected mythic giants onto relics they could not explain. Debated. Yet the persistence of giant builder traditions across cultures suggests a surprisingly stable memory. Someone existed before ordinary humanity rose to prominence, someone whose scale overwhelmed the imagination. How does one reconcile academic caution with mythic consistency? How does one weigh physical evidence against ancient memory without dismissing either? And does the tension between them reveal more about the past or about us? This chapter leans into that tension, considering how ruins speak differently depending on who listens. To the earliest post-flood survivors, these structures may have embodied the terror of a world judged. To later generations, they became symbols of lost grandeur, evidence of civilizations whose reach exceeded their wisdom. And to us, they raise enduring questions about origins, legends, and the boundary between the possible and the mythic. Even when stripped of hyperbole, the reality remains. Humanity has always struggled to explain the inexplicable. When stones seem older than chronology, minds reach for giants. When architecture surpasses expected capability, memory reaches for builders who transcended ordinary proportion. But gradually, judgment encroached like a storm over the horizon. According to Genesis, the violence of the Nephilim contributed to the unraveling of the antediluvian world. Strength, once a gift, had become a weapon. Architecture, once an expression, became a monument to pride. And pride in the biblical narrative always sows its own downfall. Yet even as the floodwaters rose, some of their constructions remained anchored, their stones resisting even the fury of global upheaval. Why did the waters not erase them entirely? Why did the footprints of a condemned people persist beneath silt and time? Could remnants of their craft have survived to serve as memorials or warnings? When humanity eventually resettled the earth, these remnants became the earliest museums of judgment and wonder combined. The giants had shaped the very terrain, terraces, embankments, towering stones, leaving physical theology engraved across continents. Their ruin testified that power without obedience fractures the world, and their scattered foundations hinted that even the strongest builders cannot escape the author of the world's true architecture. But this interpretation emerges slowly, across centuries of storytelling, translation, and remembrance. And so one more question rises: what broke their world, divine judgment or the collapse of their own corrupted genius? At last, the chapter stands on its final threshold. Imagine an ancient traveler pausing before a half-fallen megalith, its bulk casting a long shadow across the fatting sunlit dust. The stone leans as if weary from holding memories no voice can fully speak, as though only one thin moment separates revelation from silence. And in that moment, a single image remains unresolved. A colossal foundation crumbling at the edges, as if waiting for the world to remember the hands that shaped it. A faint shimmer touches the edge of the primeval sky, a trembling brightness descending like a fallen star. The ancient world remembered such moments not as mythic poetry, but as the first ruptures between heaven and earth, when celestial beings stepped into mortal soil, carrying knowledge never meant for human hands. In this charged threshold, before the world learned the meaning of rebellion, the earliest builders stirred. What shapes were they trying to imitate? What patterns glimmered in their minds, borrowed from realms beyond sight? And why does imitation turn so easily into defiance? Many traditions describe the descent of the Watchers, those enigmatic figures who, according to the Enochic literature non-canonical, crossed the boundary between the divine and the terrestrial. Their arrival was not quiet. It transformed the landscape of human understanding. They taught skills the early world had not yet earned: metallurgy, the movements of stars, and the geometry of sacred space. But this teaching came wrapped in transgression. What happens when knowledge is given without wisdom? When power arrives without preparation? When heavenly insight is severed from heavenly obedience? Human voices whispered these questions for generations. Knowledge became a seed, but rebellion became its soil. And the giants were its fruit. The Nephilim inherited this hybrid legacy, part earthly body, part celestial echo, and within them surged an impulse to build. Yet their desire was not simply to construct, it was to replicate. Something in them reached upward, longing to reshape the world according to memories or impressions not wholly their own. Could they see faint outlines of heavenly architecture, patterns of order, harmony, radiant geometry? Did they believe that by stamping such designs into the soil, they might re-establish communion with the realm their fathers abandoned? Or did their creations mask a deeper pride, an attempt not to mirror heaven but to rival it? The weight of these questions settles over ancient ruins scattered across the Near East. Archaeologists occasionally identify ritual centers whose scale and precision exceed the expectations for early societies. Some of these sites, stone circles, raised platforms, massive ceremonial enclosures, suggest not mere habitation but cosmic orientation. Alignments echo solstices. Pathways mimic celestial arcs. Terraces appear carved with a precision that hints at esoteric mathematics. While mainstream scholarship does not attribute such works to literal giants, these features nonetheless mirror traditions of beings who manipulated the earth with forbidden knowledge. Could these constructions reflect an attempt to anchor heavenly patterns into earthly soil? Or are we simply witnessing early human genius interpreted through mythic memory? The breadth of the narrative thickens here, for every culture interprets its origins differently. In the ancient Near East, stories often describe semi-divine heroes raising walls, temples, and gardens, figures like Gilgamesh, Lugalbanda, or distant kings whose ancestry blurred the human and the divine. Such legends bear an uncanny resemblance to the biblical portrayal of the mighty ones who roamed the world before the flood. Were these parallels coincidence, or faint ripples from a shared historical river? And why do so many civilizations insist that their earliest architects were not ordinary men? Landscapes themselves seemed reshaped under these influences. According to some traditions, the giants imposed unnatural terraces, redirected waters, carved plains, and established ritual centers at the edges of settled life. These were not random constructions. They were intentional, symbolic, oriented. Some scholars suggest hypothesis that such structures embodied early cosmological ideas: mountains representing divine thrones, stairways echoing the descent of heavenly beings, circles mirroring constellations. If so, then architecture becomes not merely structure but theology in stone. Yet the paradox remains unresolved. Why would beings whose very existence was unstable seek permanence in stone? If their origins were rooted in rebellion, did they build as a defense against judgment, as a monument to ambition, as a desperate attempt to freeze a moment of identity before the world that birthed them dissolved? Or did they build simply because they sensed the brevity of their time and wished to carve their names into eternity? These questions circle like birds over desert ruins. Quiet, patient watching. The chapter's tension deepens as we consider how every architectural marvel attributed to the giants carries a dual message: grandeur and corruption intertwined. The giants might have mirrored heavenly structures, but their mirror was cracked. Their craft, though extraordinary, became entangled with moral decay. And so their buildings stood not only as expressions of power, but as monuments of disordered desire. Now imagine a valley at dusk. At its center rises a colossal foundation, broad as a temple, silent as judgment. Its stones face upward, toward a sky that no longer welcomes its makers. A final question lingers there, unspoken. What were they trying to reclaim? But everything changed when the giants began shaping the earth with the very knowledge their celestial fathers had misused. When forbidden instruction translated into physical form, the transformation was neither gradual nor subtle. Landscapes shifted, horizons sharpened, valleys that once lay wild and unclaimed suddenly bore the imprint of minds sculpting the world with purpose that bordered on obsession. Why did these beings feel compelled to reproduce heavenly order in earthly soil? Why did rebellion manifest not only in their bodies, but in the stones beneath their feet? And why did the ground itself seem to recoil beneath their ambition? Some ancient traditions describe how the Watchers, before their judgment, taught metallurgy, introducing early humanity to bronze, iron, and ornamentation long before such skills became widespread. But to their giant offspring, this knowledge meant something different. Strength amplified technique, geometry guided force. The result: structures rising with a scale and precision that defy simple explanations. When the Book of Enoch recounts these teachings' non-canonical tradition, it frames them as violations of cosmic boundaries. Teaching astronomy was not merely about charting stars. It was about orienting human thought toward powers they could not control. Teaching geometry was not simply about shaping space. It was about modeling the architecture of realms mortals were never meant to imitate. And so each stone the giants placed became an echo, half memory, half rebellion. Every monument carries the echo of its maker's heart. Not all blueprints are meant for Earth. As ritual centers emerged around these constructions, the world grew stranger. Some sites appeared deliberately oriented toward celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, star paths observed across early skies. While such alignments can reflect early astronomy, they also evoke the traditions of beings who sought to bend heaven downward through imitation. Early communities gathered at these centers not merely to survive but to witness. Witness what? The merging of earth and sky. The authority of giant rulers who traced heavenly patterns in stone, or the unsettling realization that the world was no longer shaped solely by human imagination. Archaeology often stops short of myth, but even cautious scholars acknowledge the mystery of early ritual landscapes. Megalithic circles, raised mounds, monumental altars, and long straight causeways appear in regions whose population should not have possessed such knowledge, or at least, not at the level implied by their design hypothesis. Did the giants teach these practices? Did humanity imitate the imitators? Or were these sacred sites the result of cultural memory, attempting to replicate architecture that once towered over them? The pace of the narrative quickens now, for questions multiply faster than answers. If the giant builders imitated heaven, what exactly were they copying? Angelic sanctuaries glimpsed through forbidden encounters, dim recollections inherited from fallen celestial fathers, or perhaps corrupted versions of true divine patterns that only fractured further when filtered through rebellion. And what becomes of a world where every stone carries theological tension, caught between aspiration and disobedience? Tell me your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? But beneath these questions lies another truth. Imitation is never neutral. To replicate heaven without the permission of heaven is to challenge the authority that governs both realms. The giants, driven by a fractured identity, seemed compelled to anchor permanence into a world where their own existence was under judgment. They built as though their survival depended on it. They built as though their names could be carved into eternity before the coming flood erased their time. But permanence born of rebellion cannot survive its own foundation. Did they sense the approaching storm? Did they feel the tremor of divine displeasure rippling through their veins? Or were they blinded by the very knowledge that empowered them? As the ritual centers multiplied, circles of stone, stepped terraces, towering foundations, early humanity gathered in their shadows. Some admired, some feared, all remembered. And memory, once etched into collective consciousness, becomes harder to erase than stone. Even after the giants fell, the traditions surrounding their works continued shaping cultural myths for thousands of years. People spoke of their strength, yes, but they also spoke of their longing. A longing not merely to dominate, but to recreate. To rebuild what had been lost. To restore heavenly order without heavenly blessing. The sun now sinks behind a monumental foundation, and its light spills across the stone like a departing whisper. Above it, the sky glows red, unreachable, distant, silent. And the unresolved image remains. A colossal base stretching upward, yearning for a heaven forever closed to its makers. And now the story reaches its tightening center, for the giants' impulse to build, born from borrowed brilliance, collided inevitably with the fragile reality of their existence. They were beings shaped by contradiction, part earthly, part celestial, part grandeur, part corruption. And this fracture seeped into every foundation they laid. Imagine them standing before vast stretches of unformed earth, sensing echoes of heavenly architecture imprinted upon their memory. What did they feel in those moments? A longing to restore what their fathers forfeited, a desire to rival the brilliance of heaven itself, or an unspoken fear that their time was already slipping away. The giant structures, whether literal or remembered through the filter of ancient myth, hint at a deeper truth. Rebellion often imitates what it betrays. The Watchers had abandoned their proper place, and their sons inherited the consequences of that rupture. Yet within them flickered a distorted reflection of celestial order. They arranged stones in patterns recalling heavenly symmetry. They carved terraces that climbed like artificial mountains. They aligned their sanctuaries with stars they barely understood. Why? Because imitation offered the illusion of belonging. Because architecture promised permanence in a world where they themselves were unstable. Because creation, even when corrupted, longs to echo its source. Rebellion wears the mask of remembrance. Even corrupted light still tries to shine. Ancient Near Eastern parallels deepen this tension. Stories of heroes with divine ancestry erecting temples and fortified cities surface across Mesopotamia, Canaan, and beyond. Gilgamesh, said to be two-thirds divine, rebuilds walls unmatched in size. Legends from Ugarit speak of guardian beings constructing sacred enclosures. Although distinct from biblical tradition, these accounts nonetheless resonate, as though cultures scattered across centuries were all circling the same memory. Extraordinary builders whose identity blurred the boundary between human and heavenly. But did these tales preserve literal history? Or did they arise from humanity's need to explain structures that surpassed ordinary understanding? Scripture subtly counters these grand narratives. In Genesis, the emphasis is not on the giants' creativity but on their corruption. Their renown stems not from holy craftsmanship but from violence, pride, and domination. Their innovations, however impressive, are framed as distortions rather than blessings. And so every giant-built monument becomes a double-edged symbol, testimony to borrowed brilliance and testimony to moral decay. If their architecture reflected heavenly patterns, it did so through a shattered mirror. And a shattered mirror can only distort what it tries to imitate. But everything shifts when we consider the existential question beneath all this building. Why did beings born of instability seek permanence in stone? If the Watchers knew judgment awaited them, did their sons sense the same approaching reckoning? Did they build as though trying to anchor themselves to the world they feared losing? Did they carve their legacy into earth to resist the floodwaters already gathering in the divine imagination? Or did they build because creation itself was slipping from their grip, and only stone felt steady enough to bear the weight of their rebellion? Tell me your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Humanity's memory preserved these tensions with remarkable resilience. Long after the giants vanished, stories of heavenly imitation survived in whispered traditions. Some claimed the giants built temples to call down heavenly presence. Others said they shaped ritual landscapes to recapture lost glory. Some traditions even imagined them trying to ascend through architecture, constructing heights that mirrored celestial thrones. Enoch tradition. Though speculative, such images capture the emotional core of their ambition. Beings trapped between two worlds, reaching for one that no longer welcomed them. And yet their efforts failed. Cosmic imitation could not mend the gap rebellion created. Architectural grandeur could not reclaim heavenly favor. The Nephilim built as though stone could shield them from divine judgment, but stone has never been a refuge from the one who crafted both heaven and earth. When the deluge approached, their monuments, magnificent, imposing, impossible, could not stand against the waters. Imitation without obedience collapses under the weight of its own intention. Still, fragments of their world endured. Foundations remained, silent and colossal. Ritual platforms lingered beneath layers of time. And in these remnants, one unresolved image persists. A towering base reaching upward, as though its builders had paused mid-construction, waiting for a sky that would never again receive them. The last glow of sunset catches the stone, and its shadow stretches like a memory that refuses to die. And there it stands still, unfinished, yearning, unanswered. A low gray dawn settles over a field of broken basalt, each stone cold, dark, and strangely deliberate in its placement. The wind drags a thin veil of dust across their surfaces, revealing lines too smooth for accident, too geometric for chance. In the silence, the earth seems to whisper of a world older than memory, an age before kingdoms were born, before tribes carved borders, before the human story stood upright. Could these stones truly be the remnants of a vanished realm? Could they carry the echo of builders whose size defied the scale of the land itself? And if they do, what truth hides inside their endurance? Across the Levant, vast formations of basalt rise like frozen waves, massive fields of interlocking blocks, some arranged with a precision that inspires wonder and debate. Archaeologists often classify many as natural lava flows, shaped by time rather than intention. But ancient tradition does not always agree. In the myths of surrounding cultures, these stones are the scattered remnants of pre-flood structures, collapsed palaces, or the shattered bones of antediluvian cities. Whose memory should we trust? The cautious voice of scientific analysis, or the stubborn persistence of stories repeated across centuries? Must we choose only one interpretation, or can the truth breathe between them? Some ruins exist between geology and memory. Stones can inherit stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, echoing through ancient Mesopotamia, speaks of great men and cities swallowed by divine judgment, framing catastrophe as both cleansing and consequence. Though distinct from the biblical narrative, its flood myth bears striking resonance. A world undone, a civilization erased, a landscape transformed by waters that spared nothing but fragments. Could the ruins described in these early stories reflect cultural memory of structures predating the flood? Or did later generations project myth onto monoliths they did not understand? And what does it mean when multiple civilizations, separated by distance and language, describe their earliest ruins as works of beings larger than life? Legends from the ancient Near East often recount cities built by giants, places where walls towered, gates loomed, and stones weighed more than early humanity could lift. Some traditions speak of antediluvian kings whose cities reached across mountainsides, crafted by labor forces whose strength bordered on supernatural. Yet when asked whether these accounts reflect literal history or mythic embellishment, the earth offers only fragments, Cyclopean masonry, oversized tombs, and enigmatic terraces whose dating eludes certainty. Are these traces true architecture of the pre-flood world? Or did post-flood survivors, traumatized by loss, interpret natural formations as remnants of a civilization too vast to grasp? The Levant contains several structures whose ancient alignments and immense dimensions invite speculation. Places like Rujum al-Hiri, a massive circular stone complex in the Golan Heights, consist of labyrinthine rings and monumental basalt slabs. While mainstream archaeology places its construction in the Bronze Age, some fringe theories hypothesis link its form to memories of antediluvian builders. Even if such claims lack scientific consensus, the symbolism persists. Whenever humanity encounters stones beyond ordinary proportion, the imagination reaches backward toward a world where giants once shaped the land. But the chapter's purpose is not to claim certainty. It is to investigate the tension where myth meets archaeology. History is not merely the story of what happened. It is the story of what people remembered happening. And memory can preserve truths distorted through trauma, fear, reverence, or misunderstanding. Could pre-flood architecture, if it existed, have been erased so thoroughly by catastrophe that only its ghost remains in the form of suspicious formations and half-buried structures? Could ancient storytellers, struggling to reconcile ruin with reality, have filled the void with giant builder narratives to explain the inexplicable? And yet, the persistence of these narratives cannot be ignored. Why do so many cultures associate their oldest, most mysterious constructions with beings of extraordinary scale? Why do ruins across continents, from the Levant to Anatolia to Africa, sometimes carry oral traditions linking them to colossal builders long lost to time? And why do these motifs resemble each other so closely, despite the vast distances separating the people who preserved them? As the wind shifts, dust gathers in the seams between basalt blocks, seams that look almost intentional, almost architectural. A traveler kneeling beside them would feel the subtle precision beneath their fingertips, the faint geometry carved not by chance but by something else, something the world forgot or tried to forget. And in that trembling moment, an image emerges. Ruins half buried in sediment, waiting like a question the earth still refuses to answer. But everything changed when the flood arrived, not only reshaping continents but reshaping memory itself. Civilizations shattered, landscapes twisted. Whatever structures existed before the deluge, whether architectural or geological, now lay broken beneath layers of mud, silt, and silence. And yet fragments persisted, great blocks scattered like bones, terraces sheared apart, monoliths stranded in remote places where no early culture should have built. How did ancient survivors interpret these fragments? What meaning did they attach to stones out of place? And why did nearly every post-flood society insist that the world before them had been inhabited by beings too large, too strong, too extraordinary for mortal comparison? In the flood myths of Mesopotamia, the deluge strikes suddenly, destroying cities, swallowing mountains, uprooting entire worlds. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes ruins washed clean by divine waters, remnants of a civilization that once thrived but now lies buried beneath new terrain. While its geography remains debated, the emotional truth is unmistakable. Pre-flood life vanished so completely that only scattered stones remained as testimony. These same ruins, when encountered by later generations, naturally invited questions. Who built them? Why were they so enormous? And what kind of beings could have shaped structures now lying fractured under centuries of sediment? Memory survives where architecture fails. Ruins speak when words are lost. Across the Levant and its surrounding regions, enormous basalt fields, some arranged eerily, others purely natural, became canvases upon which memory painted its stories. Post-flood peoples often lived amid the debris of a world not their own. They walked across tilted slabs, basalt corridors, and massive stone configurations that seemed too deliberate to dismiss. Archaeologists identify many of these as geological formations, yet oral traditions insisted otherwise. Stories claimed these were fragments of antediluvian cities swallowed by judgment, remnants of giants who shaped the land with hands larger than the tools of later humanity. Were these simply attempts to explain natural formations, or were they cultural memories of a world truly altered beyond recognition? The question tightens when we consider Cyclopean masonry, stonework using blocks so large that modern engineers still debate how ancient builders moved them. While most of these structures hail from post-flood periods, their presence near biblical land sparked a powerful association. If humans could not build such walls easily, then someone, something, greater must have done so before human skill matured. Tradition thus retroactively attributed many megalithic works to pre-flood giants. Even if chronologically impossible according to scientific models, these associations reveal the deep psychological imprint left by encountering stones that defied expectation. And then there are the legends of antediluvian cities, vast metropolises supposedly spread across valleys now lost beneath alluvial plains. Some describe towers carved into mountains, others mention palaces swallowed whole when the earth split apart. These stories, preserved in fragments across cultures, bear the strong imprint of trauma. Survivors of any catastrophe tend to mythologize what came before, especially when visible remnants are ambiguous. Could natural formations have become the skeletons of imagined cities? Could the human mind, desperate to connect fragments into narrative, have populated the ancient world with giants because the stones themselves felt too large for ordinary builders? Yet the persistence of giant builder motifs across continents argues for something more than coincidence. Why would distant cultures independently develop myths of pre-human or superhuman architects? Why do ruins consistently awaken narratives of colossal beings, even in societies with no contact with Near Eastern traditions? And what does this say about humanity's relationship with the monumental, our need to attribute size to greatness, and greatness to beings beyond ourselves? Tell me your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? The distinction between archaeology and memory becomes essential here. Archaeology reconstructs facts, myth reconstructs meaning, but myths often carry truths disguised beneath metaphor and exaggeration. Could the pre-flood world, whatever its true nature, have left impressions so profound that survivors and their descendants encoded them in story rather than stone? Could the image of giant builders be a symbolic remembrance of forces, societies, or beings that vanished in the rupture of the flood? Or could certain formations genuinely preserve distorted echoes of structures crafted by hands now forgotten? Slowly, a shadow falls across one such ruin, a basalt wall half buried, half broken, angled against the horizon like a monument caught between worlds. Its stones are silent, yet their silence presses against the imagination. And the unresolved question rises like dust in the evening light. What if some stones remember more than we do? And now the story deepens into its most haunting silence, for whatever existed before the flood, whether cities, terraces, temples, or natural formations misread as architecture, was violently reshaped by an event Scripture frames as judgment and ancient myth remembers as catastrophe. What fragments survived did so only by accident, by weight, by stubborn endurance against water and time. But to the earliest post-flood generations, these fragments were not mere stones. They were the fingerprints of a lost world. What does a civilization do when confronted with ruins it did not build? How does a fragile people interpret structures whose scale mocks its own? And why did the memory of giants cling so persistently to those stones? Traditions from across the Near East and beyond describe antediluvian cities swallowed by the flood, cities whose ruins later travelers mistook for the works of mighty beings. Some legends tell of palaces shattered by divine wrath. Others speak of chambers carved into the sides of mountains that once housed rulers of unimaginable stature. The Gilgamesh flood account, though distinct from Genesis, captures this sense of irrevocable loss, a world washed away, leaving only debris scattered like broken chronology. These stories do not agree in detail, but they share a core intuition that something immense collapsed, leaving traces humanity struggled to interpret. The oldest mysteries rise from broken ground. Ruins are memory's last handwriting. Archaeological mysteries deepen the tension. In the Levant, elongated basalt ridges, collapsed circles, and unnatural terraces sometimes appear too structured for nature yet too damaged for certain human attribution. Some are indeed geological phenomena, others remain ambiguous. Rujum al-Hiri, with its 5 concentric rings of massive stone, raises questions scholars still debate. Was it ritual? Was it astronomical? Was it simply a Bronze Age construction misinterpreted through legend? Or does its strange geometry preserve an echo, distorted, faint, but persistent, of a pre-flood worldview now buried beneath layers of reconstructed history? Without certainty, we walk between realms, fact on one side, memory on the other. As stories traveled through generations, they absorbed trauma. Flood survivors would have passed on fragmented recollections to their descendants. Broken landscapes became symbols. Ruins became markers of a judgment their ancestors barely escaped. And in this retelling, giants became the natural authors of anything too large, too precise, or too impossible for ordinary hands. But why giants? Why not forgotten human civilizations? Why not celestial beings themselves? Perhaps because giants embodied the threshold between heaven and earth, creatures strong enough to shape mountainsides, rebellious enough to merit destruction. Their image fit the scale of the ruins better than anything else the imagination could supply. But everything changes when we consider the possibility that memory exaggerates without lying. A natural formation might have been interpreted through the lens of trauma. A human-built structure might have been magnified through centuries of retelling. A genuinely anomalous ruin might have inspired legends far grander than its original purpose. And yet, behind all exaggeration lies a spark of truth. Some ancestral peoples clearly believed they were walking among the remains of a world greater, older, and more formidable than their own. Whether or not giants literally built these structures, the idea of a giant builder civilization endured because the stones themselves demanded an explanation. Tell me your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? The chapter's tension reaches its climax here. Were these stones remnants of pre-flood architecture or remnants of pre-flood imagination? Could they be distorted memories of a destroyed civilization? Could they preserve fragments of structures crafted by beings later mythologized as Nephilim? Or were they simply geological shapes interpreted through awe and fear? No answer satisfies every question. Archaeology provides data but not meaning. Myth provides meaning but not certainty. And in this crossroads, ancient storytellers filled the void with beings large enough, both physically and symbolically, to account for what their eyes beheld. Now imagine kneeling before a ruin half sunk in sediment, its upper stones exposed like ribs breaking through ancient skin. The air hums with a stillness that feels older than language. You brush the dust aside, but the stone offers no inscription, no clear era, no final truth. Only an image remains. A structure waiting in the earth, as if the world itself has withheld one last memory from us. A deep, rolling darkness gathers over the ancient world, clouds thick as stone pressing upon valleys and cities built by hands now trembling under judgment. The air grows heavy, charged with a silence that feels impossibly vast, as though the sky itself is inhaling before a catastrophic exhale. In that moment between calm and annihilation, one question trembles across the land. What becomes of the works of the mighty when the Maker of the world decides to wash the earth clean? What happens to walls that scrape the heavens when the heavens themselves open? And can any monument stand against water, the most patient, most relentless destroyer ever known? Genesis describes the deluge with horrifying brevity. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, it says, and the windows of heaven were opened. Torrents fell in sheets, drowning cities, forests, plains, and mountainsides. Storms roared like cosmic engines. Structures that once stood immovable shuddered, cracked, and dissolved beneath forces they were never designed to resist. Giants whose strength had shaped landscapes now found their world collapsing under them. The deluge was not only a judgment on their bodies, it was a judgment on their architecture. Why build monuments of stone when they cannot withstand the weight of divine anger? Why carve permanence into a world destined to be undone? Water is the great equalizer of the proud. Even giants cannot outbuild judgment. As the floodwaters rose, pre-flood structures, whatever their true nature, met wildly different fates. Some were smashed by currents powerful enough to uproot ancient forests. Others were buried beneath miles of transported sediment as rivers reversed and mountains fractured. Still others, remarkably, may have remained intact, sealed beneath geological layers like relics trapped in amber. How much of the giant's world lies hidden beneath our feet? How many Cyclopean foundations might rest far below the reach of excavation, preserved but unreachable? And if they endure, what stories remain locked inside them? Geologists studying ancient cataclysms observe that violent floods can transport enormous boulders, carve canyons within days, and bury entire landscapes under thick stratified layers. This scientific lens offers a plausible context for how remnants of colossal works, real or interpreted, could survive. A wall might be toppled but preserved beneath layers of silt. A platform could collapse, then be fossilized in mud. A structure might break apart and scatter across a valley, later mistaken for natural formations. While archaeology requires caution, the mechanisms of destruction described in Genesis align chillingly with what catastrophic water can achieve. Post-flood survivors stepping onto reshaped terrain would have encountered a world barely recognizable. Rivers carved new beds, mountain slopes lay stripped or rearranged, debris fields stretched across plains, littered with stones too large for their communities to move. Imagine their confusion, their fear, their awe. What would they think when stumbling upon massive slabs half buried in mud? Would they see them as natural leftovers from a geological upheaval, or as fragments of the very giants who perished in the deluge? And how quickly do broken stones become the seeds of legend? As cultures rebuilt, memories of the pre-flood world did not fully vanish. The survivors knew giants had lived before the catastrophe. They had heard stories, seen ruins, felt the weight of the past. So when they encountered megalithic debris, stones displaced by unimaginable forces, they naturally associated them with Nephilim architecture. Whether or not these stones truly belonged to giant-built structures, the interpretation endured. In this way, the flood did something paradoxical. It destroyed the giants' world, yet preserved their shadows. The waters swept away their cities, but in scattering, burying, and fracturing their monuments, the flood ensured that traces, however distorted, would remain as silent witnesses. And so the interplay between destruction and memory takes center stage. The giants fell, but parts of their craft became eternalized not by design but by catastrophe. Flood sediment sealed some structures away like time capsules. Rockfalls buried others under protective layers. Riverbeds trapped foundations in sediment. What humanity found after the waters receded was not the giant's world, but the skeleton of it, broken, rearranged, mythologized. Now imagine a diver descending through murky depths beside an ancient shoreline. Their hand grazes a stone edge, too smooth, too sharp, too deliberate. Silt drifts like ghostly breath across a submerged foundation, untouched for ages. A silent question stirs in the deep. If the flood erased the giants, why do their fingerprints endure beneath our feet? But everything changed when the waters finally began their retreat, revealing not a restored world but a wounded one. Hills wore new shapes, valleys lay inverted, shorelines stretched miles beyond their old boundaries. It was as though the earth itself had been lifted, shaken, and set down again in an unfamiliar configuration. Into this disordered landscape stepped the survivors, Noah's family, confronting a world scattered with remnants they could not fully interpret. What did they feel when they saw stones lodged in impossible places? What did they think when massive boulders lay far from any mountain that could have birthed them? And how did they explain walls, platforms, or debris fields that bore the subtle hint of intention? The biblical narrative does not dwell on the post-flood landscape, but geological principles help us imagine its condition. Catastrophic floods can move multi-ton rocks as easily as a river carries leaves. Water pressure can rip apart structures, transport them miles, and deposit them in foreign terrain. Entire settlements can vanish beneath sudden sedimentation. If any giant-built architecture existed before the flood, the deluge would have treated it with brutal impartiality, shattering some works, entombing others, and scattering many beyond recognition. The flood was not a sculptor, it was a destroyer. Yet destruction sometimes preserves what it cannot erase. Water buries as often as it breaks. The past survives in fragments no one expects. Over time, as post-flood societies multiplied and spread across new regions, they inevitably encountered areas where the ground itself hinted at an earlier age. A half-buried foundation, a row of stones aligned too neatly to dismiss, a massive slab resting at a tilt suggestive of collapsed architecture. The earliest generations, still carrying memories of the pre-flood world, may have recognized these fragments for what they were, remains of a civilization judged. Later generations, however, lacking first-hand knowledge, interpreted them through myth. They told stories of giant kings whose cities were swallowed by the waters. They traced the outlines of stones and imagined the giants who had placed them. Archaeologically, flood events, even localized ones, are capable of sealing structures beneath thick layers of sediment. In Mesopotamia, for example, multiple flood deposits have preserved ancient settlements in near-perfect condition. When such layers are uncovered, they often reveal architecture frozen in time. If a global-scale deluge occurred as Genesis describes, the amount of preserved pre-flood material, if any existed, could be immense, though likely inaccessible beneath deep stratigraphy. Could some of the world's puzzling geological anomalies be relics of structures locked beneath such layers? Or are these impressions merely projections of human imagination onto natural forms? How do we distinguish buried architecture from geological coincidence? The survivors of the flood likely walked through debris fields stretching for miles, fragments of mountainsides, pieces of forests, boulders transported by forces unimaginable today. Some may have recognized materials from regions far upstream, startling evidence of the flood's power. Others may have seen the remains of damaged structures whose original purpose was now impossible to discern. Over time, as memory softened into narrative, these impressions hardened into tradition. Giants built the world before the waters came. Whether literal or metaphorical, the belief endured. The interplay between destruction and preservation becomes central here. Floodwaters may obliterate structures entirely, or preserve them in ways that render them even more mysterious. A toppled wall could be fossilized beneath mud. A broken monolith might lie undisturbed for millennia. A ritual platform could collapse, then become the foundation of a new geological layer. The very act of judgment, in this sense, becomes a preserver of shadows, traces of a world erased yet not fully forgotten. As post-flood peoples migrated further, encountering ruins that predated their cultural memory, they interpreted them through the only lens available, the stories of their ancestors. If giants once lived, and if their power was great, then surely such immense stones belonged to them. Thus, myth filled the gaps that archaeology could not. Tradition became the bridge between memory and interpretation. And the ruins, whatever their true origin, became the silent tutors of awe. Now imagine a nomadic family settling beside a river centuries after the flood. As they clear land for dwelling, they uncover massive stones arranged in a line beneath the soil. No inscription, no clear function, just weight, immovable, ancient, foreign. They pause, unsettled by the unexpected order hidden within the earth. Whose hands placed these stones? What purpose guided their alignment? And why did the flood choose to bury rather than obliterate? A final image emerges. Monolithic slabs sealed inside sediment, waiting like relics suspended between destruction and memory. And now the narrative sinks into the deepest layers of the earth, into the places where water, pressure, and time have conspired to seal memories no living eye has seen. For the flood did not merely erase the world that came before, it rearranged it, concealed it, folded it into geological strata where silence reigns. What remains of the giant's world is therefore not a visible city, not a preserved palace, but a scattered anatomy of shadows. What does it mean for a civilization to be remembered not by what stands, but by what lies hidden? And why do certain patterns in the earth seem to recall forms that should not exist? Scientific study of catastrophic floods reveals mechanisms powerful enough to reshape entire continents. Water can scour landscapes bare, carve deep channels, deposit layers of sediment dozens of meters thick, and entomb structures instantly. If the Nephilim built anything monumental before the deluge, the flood likely shattered their designs but preserved fragments within these newly formed layers. A foundation might remain intact beneath compressed mud. A monolith could sink into soft sediment and be trapped upright as the earth hardened. Even natural formations reshaped by the deluge could later mimic the contours of architecture, inviting the imagination to see intention where only chaos once ruled. Destruction is never as complete as it seems. The earth remembers what the world forgets. As centuries passed and humanity resettled the earth, the ruins they encountered were rarely whole. They found broken lines of stone, half-buried platforms, displaced boulders too heavy for their communities to move. They found fields where basalt lay in patterns that felt deliberate, as though someone, something, had arranged them in ages beyond reckoning. They found river valleys where enormous rocks sat balanced in strange positions, impossible without great force. To them, these were not geological oddities. They were the wreckage of the pre-flood giants. Myth grew naturally around debris fields, each stone becoming a relic of the world that perished. The challenge for the modern observer is separating memory from material evidence. Archaeology seeks clarity, categorizing basalt fields as volcanic, terraces as Bronze Age, and Cyclopean formations as human engineering. But mythic memory does not obey these categories. It interprets through the lens of meaning rather than mechanism. Survivors of the flood did not record sediment layers. They recorded awe, trauma, and the conviction that something immense once shaped the land. Their descendants inherited these impressions, blending them with the stones beneath their feet. Thus, the legend of Nephilim builders endured not simply because giants once existed, but because the landscape itself whispered their memory. But everything changes when we consider how the flood simultaneously judged and preserved. The deluge cleansed the earth of corruption, yet in doing so, it immortalized the shadows of that corruption. The giants' works, scattered and broken, became the fossilized backdrop for early civilizations. Their ruins, or perceived ruins, created the psychological foundation for countless myths of lost ages, forgotten builders, and vanished titans. Even if many giant-attributed structures are natural formations or later constructions, the emotional resonance remains. Humanity senses that something older than recorded history lies beneath its feet. And so the question intensifies. How much of what we call myth is memory refracted through catastrophe? Could the earliest generations, struggling to interpret the debris of a destroyed world, have preserved fragments of truth in symbolic form? Could some of the stones we dismiss as geological simply be too deep, too damaged, too displaced for confident interpretation? And what does it say about the human spirit that we continue searching for meaning in ruins the world intended to erase? Imagine a future archaeologist excavating a valley where sediment runs so deep that each layer represents a world long forgotten. As the last inch of earth is brushed aside, a shape emerges, angular, purposeful, unmistakably formed. It is not a complete structure, only a foundation line disappearing into the darkness of strata. But its angle, its smoothness, its alignment against ancient markers, all hint at intentional design. No culture in the region can account for it. No known chronology explains it. And so the earth itself becomes the storyteller. In the dim light of the dig, with silt clinging to its edges, the structure seems almost to breathe. A final whisper rises from the depths. If the flood erased the giants, why do their fingerprints still press upward through the soil? A hot wind moves across the highlands of Canaan, stirring dust around stones that seem impossibly large for the hands of ordinary men. The air vibrates with the echo of ancient footsteps, deeper and heavier than any hoof or sandal print that would come after. Something about this landscape feels older than its soil, as though the world itself has not forgotten what once walked here. And as travelers crest the ridges, one question rises with them. How did giants return after the flood? Who rebuilt the world with such colossal intent? And what compelled them to construct fortresses fit not for mortals, but for beings whose shadows stretched across valleys? Scripture speaks sparingly but clearly of this resurgence. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, names scattered across Deuteronomy and Joshua, hint at a second generation of giants inhabiting regions central to Israel's destiny. These were not legends shaped by hindsight. They were adversaries so imposing that Israel's spies trembled before them, describing themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. Were these giants true biological descendants of pre-flood Nephilim? Or were they tribes whose extraordinary stature became exaggerated through fear, myth, or poetic hyperbole? The text does not answer directly, leaving shadows for memory to inhabit. Some shadows survive the flood. Some names refuse to die. Yet the evidence of monumental construction attributed to these beings persists. Across Bashan and the surrounding territories, traditions speak of fortified cities, towering gates, and boundary stones so massive that only giants, or entire armies, could have moved them. Deuteronomy describes the iron bed of Og, king of Bashan, with dimensions so striking that scholars still debate its meaning. Was it literal, symbolic, or a royal exaggeration? Even if metaphorical, its size communicates a truth the text wants us to feel. Og was no ordinary king, and his kingdom no ordinary realm. Archaeological remains in the Bashan region reveal ancient fortifications and megalithic structures, some dating back thousands of years. While mainstream scholarship attributes these works to early human cultures, the scale of certain features, thick-walled enclosures, Cyclopean foundations, massive dolmens, has long fed local tradition associating them with giants. Though caution is necessary, the persistence of these associations offers cultural insight. People living in these regions believed they inherited lands once shaped by beings far stronger than themselves. Whether literal or symbolic, the belief mattered. It shaped identity, fear, memory, and territorial claims. Why did post-flood giants, or the tribes believed to be giants, continue building on such colossal scale? Was it a continuation of the antediluvian impulse, a cultural memory inherited from ancestors whose world had been washed away? Was it a strategic declaration of dominance meant to intimidate neighboring peoples? Or did these constructions serve practical defensive functions, requiring immense effort and coordination to secure vast territories? The motive remains uncertain, but the pattern is unmistakable. Wherever giants are mentioned, monumental architecture follows. In Anatolia, Jordan, and the Golan Heights, researchers have identified stone structures whose purpose remains ambiguous. Massive dolmen fields, some with capstones weighing tens of tons, dot the landscape. Could these be burial markers for the Rephaim, as some ancient texts suggest? Or do they represent purely human ritual landscapes that later myth absorbed into giant lore? Perhaps their true significance lies not in their origin, but in their impression, the way they shape the imagination of any who stand beneath them. The giant's presence, whether historical or remembered, becomes inseparable from the stones themselves. The biblical writers often framed these giant-inhabited regions as spiritually charged, Bashan especially, a territory associated with ancient kings, dark powers, and imposing geography. To Israel, entering such land meant not just military confrontation but psychological warfare. How does a nation of former slaves face cities whose walls seem to have been raised for beings twice their height? How does one prepare to fight enemies whose reputations thunder louder than their footsteps? Now picture an Israelite scout at dusk, standing before a fortified city in the highlands. The walls loom above him, blocks fitted so tightly that even the thinning light cannot slip between them. The gates rise like the jaws of some ancient beast. The scout swallows, feeling the immense weight of the stones, not just physical weight, but historical weight, mythic weight, spiritual weight. He wonders, as any mortal would, who were these cities truly built for? But everything changed when Israel began to move northward and eastward, entering territories long held by tribes whose very names carried the weight of dread. The closer they drew to the ancient lands of the Anakim and Rephaim, the more imposing the landscape became. Hills rose like ramparts, valleys narrowed into defensive corridors, and everywhere, on ridges, in plains, against cliffs, they found stones too large for the hands of their own craftsmen, who had raised these boundaries. What kind of ruler required fortifications of such staggering scale? And how does a newly formed nation interpret the ruins of beings it believed God himself had judged? Deuteronomy and Joshua preserve glimpses of these confrontations. Words like fortified, strongholds, and mighty men hint at cities that stood like stone giants themselves. The Rephaim inhabited regions stretching from Bashan to the valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem, places whose geography still whispers of ancient power. Bashan, ruled by Og, emerges as the epicenter of this post-flood resurgence, a kingdom so formidable that its memory endured long after its fall. The biblical note regarding Og's iron bed, measuring roughly 13 feet in length, hints at a figure whose size and authority commanded awe. Whether literal or a formalized description of royal prestige, its presence in the text signals a story the writers assumed readers understood. The giants shaped the land. Some kings build empires, others build legends. Stones remember rulers long after names fade. As Israel approached these territories, they encountered not pristine fortresses but remnants of earlier ages, walls eroded yet still massive, thresholds broadened beyond normal scale, and cities whose footprints stretched wider than ordinary settlements. These ruins, whether constructed by humans or giants, carried a residue of intimidation. Archaeologists uncover megalithic sites across the Levant whose functions are not always clear: massive gates, thick-walled enclosures, towering stone circles. Although scholars hesitate to attribute them to literal giants, the ancient people who inherited these landscapes had no such academic filter. They interpreted what they saw through ancestral memory. This is where the Rephaim lived. These stones belonged to them. What made the giants build again after the flood? If they were literal descendants of the pre-flood Nephilim, did they seek to reclaim a lost world? If they were simply powerful tribes remembered as giants, did their monumental works serve as warnings, boundaries, or declarations of supremacy? Or did myth grow naturally from the overwhelming presence of stones that defied easy explanation? The answer likely lies in a convergence of memory, fear, and the physical environment. Giants, literal or symbolic, become the perfect authors of what feels too vast for human hands. In Bashan, dolmen fields stretch across volcanic plateaus. Thousands of burial chambers formed with capstones weighing multiple tons. While mainstream archaeology dates them to early pastoral cultures, regional tradition associates them with the Rephaim, the ancient dead of a race larger than life. Whether factual or poetic, this association reveals how the landscape shaped belief. When early tribes encountered structures beyond their means, they attributed them to beings who exceeded their abilities. These attributions then produced legends, and legends produced identity. But everything intensifies when we consider the narrative tension. Israel was not merely observing these structures. They were commanded to confront the people associated with them. Imagine approaching a fortified city whose stones rise higher than any seen in Egypt or Canaan. Imagine hearing stories of warriors whose reach surpassed a man's height. Imagine trying to calculate the strength required to lift the cornerstones beneath your feet. How does one prepare psychologically for warfare against such opponents? The biblical account emphasizes divine assurance rather than human confidence. Israel was told not to fear the Anakim, not because they were an illusion, but because their existence, however understood, did not exceed the sovereignty of God. Yet the human struggle remained real. The spies in Numbers recoiled not at myth but at perceived reality. The giants were, in their eyes, undefeatable, and the ruins around them reinforced this belief. Now picture the Israelites standing before an abandoned stronghold in Bashan. The city is silent, but its walls tower overhead, darkening the earth like a cliff face. Some stones bear markings that look purposeful, though their meaning is lost. The gates lie broken, yet their immense dimensions speak of a people who expected enemies of equal size. No one in the camp can imagine marching through them without feeling dwarfed. And as night approaches, torches flicker against the colossal masonry, revealing one unshakable truth. These places were built for beings far larger than themselves. And now the story enters its moment of confrontation, where myth, memory, and material reality collide in the highlands and plains Israel would one day claim. For the giants of the post-flood world were not merely shadows in stories. They were obstacles embedded in geography, lineage, and architecture. Their structures stood like challenges carved into stone. Their names resonated through valleys. Their reputations shaped the fears of entire nations. What then did it mean for Israel to approach these colossal markers of a world not their own? And how does a people with no monumental tradition of their own stand before fortresses shaped for beings of great renown? Consider Bashan, the kingdom of Og, often described in tradition as a land of towering basalt fortifications. Archaeologists in the region have identified ancient basalt cities, Argob among them, which contain tightly fitted stones, thick walls, and foundations that seem almost overbuilt for ordinary populations. These structures, though belonging to human cultures of the Bronze Age, fuel the imagination when paired with biblical memory. The image of Og's immense iron bed only intensifies the aura. This was a ruler whose very furnishings were designed to convey dominance. Whether literal in dimension or symbolic of royal stature, the effect is the same: territorial intimidation through physical scale. Some cities speak in the language of fear. Some walls are built to shape belief. Israel's scouts, moving through the land before the conquest, were not simply assessing military logistics. They were confronting the emotional mass of legend made real. They saw fortified cities walled up to heaven, a phrase that evokes not architectural precision but psychological immensity. They compared themselves to grasshoppers, a metaphor revealing not only disparity in size but disparity in perceived significance. What happens inside the human mind when the environment itself seems designed for giants? How do you fight what feels architecturally inevitable? And what does courage look like when the stones seem to argue against your success? Scholars continue debating whether the giant clans were literally of unusual height, or whether ancient hyperbole enlarged them into myth. Yet even if some exaggeration has entered the narrative, the consistent association of these peoples with monumental building traditions suggests a deeper truth. Large-scale architecture produces large-scale reputations. When a tribe builds with stones weighing many tons, future generations naturally imagine builders matching the stones. Thus, the line between literal giants and culturally giant populations becomes blurred. Memory merges with masonry. Interpretation fuses with intimidation. But everything changes when Israel steps into the story with a different interpretive lens. Where the Canaanite tribes saw ancestral monuments guarding ancient boundaries, Israel saw symbols of a past world judged yet lingering. Where the inhabitants saw heritage, Israel saw opposition. And where nations saw walls protecting territories, Israel saw evidence of powers their God intended them to overcome. The giants' constructions, whether actual or attributed, became part of the battlefield. Intimidation weapons built centuries before Israel arrived. Imagine standing at the entrance of a refamed city at sunset. The sun bleeds across stone, igniting edges that rise impossibly high. The wind moans through openings carved far above human height. A lone scout approaches, placing his hand on a foundation stone that towers above his chest. Its surface is cold, unmoved by time. He imagines the beings who placed it there, hands large enough to wrap around its edges, strength sufficient to lift what a dozen men could not budge. The scout inhales, aware that he is touching a world older than his nation's memory, a world shaped by forces Israel is now called to challenge. What were these cities truly built for? Were they meant to house literal giants, to intimidate common enemies, to echo the lost architecture of pre-flood ancestors, or to embody a cultural identity rooted in strength and dominion? No answer arrives. The stones keep their silence. But the question remains, woven into the architecture itself. As twilight deepens, the walls merge with darkness, leaving only the faint outline of an ancient gate, broad, tall, and open like the mouth of a forgotten world. And one final, unresolved image lingers. A colossal threshold waiting for footsteps too large to echo anymore. A cool twilight settles over the high plateau of Bashan, the horizon glowing with the last ember-colored threads of day. Shadows stretch across fields of basalt, touching stones arranged in patterns older than recorded kingdoms. The land feels watchful, as though it carries memory in its very crust. Travelers who enter Bashan often speak of an ancient weight in the air, an unseen presence woven through its megalithic remnants. And perhaps the land remembers more than we do. Why does Bashan preserve such concentrated echoes of beings larger than life? Why does this region, above all others, bear the densest fusion of archaeology, legend, and spiritual geography? And what story do these stones attempt to tell through silence? The dolmen fields spread across Bashan like a graveyard of titans, thousands of massive stone burial chambers, each crowned with capstones that weigh several tons. These structures, often attributed to early pastoral cultures, nevertheless defy easy explanation. Their scale is imposing, their distribution massive, their endurance remarkable. A visitor standing among them feels dwarfed by a landscape that seems tailored for beings far larger than any tribe known in the region. Could the dolmens represent burial sites for the Rephaim, as later traditions claimed? Or were they ritual monuments whose original purpose was lost long before written language preserved the memory? In Bashan, even the graves feel alive. Stones speak where voices have died. The biblical narrative adds to this charged atmosphere, for Bashan was the kingdom of Og, last of the Rephaim mentioned in Deuteronomy. His reign left an impression strong enough to persist across centuries. Whether Og's physical stature matched literal gianthood or served as a symbolic representation of power, his memory saturates the land. The dolmens, the citadels, the fortified cities, the eerie stone alignments, together they form a mosaic that ancient Israelites interpreted through the lens of giant tradition. Bashan was not merely another region. It was a realm of the extraordinary, a territory where the natural and supernatural seemed to mingle. Yet Bashan's significance extends beyond Israelite memory. Ugaritic texts from the 2nd millennium BCE reference the Rephaim as ancestral spirits connected to sacred geography. Some rituals invoke these beings during ceremonies tied to kingship and the underworld. These traditions do not directly confirm biblical giant narratives, but they illuminate a shared cultural atmosphere in which Bashan was associated with beings who transcended ordinary human experience. Why did separate cultures view the same land as a threshold between worlds? What was it about Bashan that stirred imaginations across civilizations? Archaeologically, Bashan contains thousands of megalithic structures, dolmens, stone circles, tumuli, and complex ceremonial layouts. Rujum el-Hiyari, one of the most striking, consists of concentric rings of basalt stones forming a pattern visible only from above, with a massive cairn at its center. Scholars debate its function: astronomical observatory, ritual site, burial complex, or territorial marker. But all agree on one thing: its construction required immense effort and suggests social organization far beyond what is traditionally attributed to early pastoral societies. Could such structures reflect a lingering cultural memory of pre-flood or early post-flood monumental traditions? Or are they simply evidence of sophisticated but largely forgotten human ingenuity? As with all chapters of this ancient landscape, the narrative must balance caution with wonder. We cannot claim these sites were literally built by giants, but neither can we ignore the intensity with which ancient peoples associated Bashan with beings of extraordinary stature. Memory clings to places that provoke awe, and Bashan provokes awe in abundance. The land is rugged, its stones dark and dense, its ruins haunting. Even today, standing among the dolmens evokes a sense of trespassing into an architecture whose scale hints at more than human ambition. But the question persists: why did so many cultures attach supernatural significance to this particular region? Were the stones arranged for burial or declaration? Were the circles gathering spaces for ritual or boundary markers demarcating territories of fear? And why do these formations feel less like tombs and more like sentinels, silent guardians of a memory the earth refuses to relinquish? As the sun sinks fully below the horizon, one silhouette remains visible: a single dolmen framed against fading light, its capstone hovering like a suspended omen. It seems to stare across the land with a question older than kingdoms. Were these structures monuments to the dead or warnings to the living? But everything changed when ancient travelers began leaving records, oral, then written, about what they witnessed upon entering Bashan. This was not a land that merely contained ruins. It felt shaped by them. The basalt underfoot bore marks of cutting, stacking, levering, and alignment. Dolmens sprawled across ridgelines like immense stone coffins abandoned mid-ritual. Stone circles and tumuli hinted at ceremonies whose purpose lay beyond ordinary comprehension. And everywhere, whether in Israelite scrolls, Ugaritic hymns, or local legend, the same conclusion surfaced. Bashan was a realm of the Great Ones. What created such a powerful, cross-cultural agreement? And how does a landscape become a monument not only to the dead, but to the memory of an entire race? The dolmen fields of Bashan represent one of the largest concentrations of megalithic tombs in the world. Some capstones weigh over 20 tons, yet rest upon supporting stones arranged with unnerving precision. These were not haphazard piles of rock. They were engineered chambers. For whom? For what status of person? Burial for ordinary shepherds seems unlikely given the sheer labor required. The scale alone invites comparison to the Rephaim traditions, which cast these beings as ancient rulers or mighty ancestors whose resting places demanded extraordinary architecture. Even if the dolmens are purely human achievements, why did later generations insist on linking them to giants? Some landscapes demand larger stories. Myth grows where stone defies logic. The biblical descriptions of Og, his reign, his territory, and his stature intersect meaningfully with this archaeological setting. Og ruled over 60 fortified cities in the region of Argob, a detail that underscores the density of ancient occupation in Bashan. The text's reference to his massive iron bed further magnifies his symbolic presence. Whether literal or ceremonial, the bed's dimensions became shorthand for the extraordinary scale associated with Bashan's rulers. And in a world where architecture often mirrored authority, large-scale construction naturally implied large-scale persons. Was Og's size exaggerated to convey dominance? Or did his kingdom genuinely preserve traditions of rulers whose physical presence exceeded the ordinary? The ambiguity strengthens rather than weakens the region's mystique. Meanwhile, the Ugaritic texts introduce another layer of complexity. In these writings, the Rephaim appear not merely as giants, but as mighty ancestral spirits linked to sacred rites and the underworld. Rituals in these texts invoke them during ceremonies connected to kingship and divine blessing. The Rephaim are described as walking the earth, riding, or gathering at ceremonial locations. While not literal confirmations of biblical giants, these descriptions reveal an environment where Bashan was viewed as a spiritual threshold. Why did different cultures, separated by belief and language, envision the same region as inhabited or influenced by beings beyond normal scale? As archaeology advances, more features of Bashan come into focus. Hundreds of dolmens cluster on volcanic slopes, often aligning with astronomical markers or sacred topography. Stone circles echo patterns found in other ritual landscapes across the Levant. Tumuli rise like cairns marking spiritual boundaries. Each site demands interpretation, yet human imagination fills gaps with myth when the original purpose is lost. If a culture remembers giants, and the stones appear built for giants, the connection becomes irresistible. Memory roots itself in what the eyes behold. But everything intensifies when we consider Bashan as a liminal territory, geographically elevated, geologically distinct, and spiritually contested. For ancient Israel, Bashan was not simply another land to conquer. It was the stronghold of a king who embodied a remnant of the pre-flood world. For Ugarit, it was a gathering place of ancestral spirits. For local cultures, it was a necropolis stretching as far as one could walk. The layering of meaning over time transformed Bashan into a palimpsest of myth, memory, and stone. where each generation added interpretation upon what the previous left unexplained. Imagine an ancient wanderer pausing before a dolmen at dawn. The capstone rests tens of thousands of pounds above the earth, supported by upright slabs that seem too narrow to bear such weight. The interior chamber is dark, wide enough for a giant to crawl inside, yet too large for a single human corpse. The wanderer feels a prickling unease. Who built this? Who demanded such a tomb? And why do so many of these monuments face the same direction, as though oriented toward a forgotten horizon? As the sun rises, its first beams ignite the dolmen's edges, turning cold basalt into a silhouette of power. In that moment, the structure seems not to honor the dead, but to warn the living. And now the narrative draws us deeper into Bashan's uncanny resonance, where archaeology, memory, and myth converge so tightly that separating them becomes nearly impossible. Bashan does not merely contain ancient structures, it exudes their presence. The stones feel deliberate, the alignments purposeful, the atmosphere charged with a gravity that outlasts the cultures who once shaped it. Why does this region bear such concentrated associations with giants? Why do so many traditions, from Israelite to Ugaritic to local folklore, agree that Bashan was a realm touched by beings larger than life? And what hidden language do these megaliths speak when viewed as a collective landscape rather than isolated anomalies? The dolmens, towering across ridges and valleys, remain the most visible testimony. Thousands of them lie scattered like the vertebrae of a titanic skeleton, each capstone balanced with perplexing precision upon supporting stones. Their chambers often open to specific horizons, east toward rising light, or toward sacred peaks that once anchored spiritual geography. Whether burial, ritual, or boundary markers, their sheer number and scale suggest a cultural preoccupation with death, memory, and power. And if later cultures believed the Rephaim were buried here, then Bashan becomes not only a necropolis, but a repository of ancestral dread. Even if these structures were built by ordinary humans, they bear the emotional weight of a world haunted by something extraordinary. Some landscapes refuse to forget. Stone remembers what history omits. The traditions surrounding Og deepen this imprint. As the last of the Rephaim mentioned in Deuteronomy, Og represents a lingering presence of the old world, a remnant of something pre-flood, whether literal or symbolic. His kingdom, sprawling across Bashan, contained fortified cities whose density impressed the biblical writers. 60 cities in one region implies not only population, but power, organization, and influence. The memory of Og, magnified through sacred text, merges seamlessly with the dolmens and basalt ruins. The stones become extensions of his legend, and when later readers encounter these megaliths, the connection feels intuitive. This was the land of a giant king. Meanwhile, Ugaritic texts echo the notion that Bashan served as a spiritual threshold. In these writings, the Rephaim appear as ancestral beings who assemble, travel, and interact with the world during ritual moments. They are described as warriors of old, echoing the Genesis phrase, mighty men of renown. These parallels do not confirm a shared historical population, but they reveal a consistent perception. Bashan belonged to beings who stood between worlds. Whether spirits, ancestors, or mythologized giants, their presence saturated the region's ritual life. Why did cultures with different languages, pantheons, and political aims give Bashan such supernatural weight? Perhaps the landscape itself suggested a story they naturally filled with beings worthy of its vast, brooding monuments. But everything changes when we consider Bashan as a narrative battleground between memory and meaning. Archaeology tells us the dolmens were constructed during the early Bronze Age by human societies with strong organizational capacity. Myth tells us they belonged to giants. Neither voice cancels the other. Instead, they form an uneasy harmony. The human builders may have created the structures, but later generations, standing before stones too massive for their own tools, assigned them to giants because giants provided the most satisfying explanation. Myth grows where material overwhelms comprehension. And so the story of Bashan becomes less about proving literal giants and more about understanding why so many believed giants were necessary to explain this land. When thousands of tombs, stone circles, and ritual complexes fill a territory, they create a psychological presence that transcends their builders. The landscape shapes identity. It shapes imagination. It shapes fear. Now imagine a lone shepherd walking at dusk along the edge of a dolmen field. The last sunlight catches the top of a massive capstone, making it glow like an ember suspended over the earth. The shepherd pauses, sensing the weight of the place, not physical but historical, spiritual, the kind of weight that makes the hair lift on the back of the neck. He wonders what stories his ancestors told about these stones, and whether the dead they honored were ever ordinary. The wind moves across the dolmens like a whispered procession, stirring dust into faint spirals. And in that moment the land seems to ask its own question, soft, ancient, unsettling. Were these monuments raised for the dead, or warnings meant to outlive the living? A pale morning tide washes over a distant shoreline, revealing a single standing stone poised against the horizon like a sentinel of memory. Its presence feels familiar, even though it belongs to a land far from the Near East. The wind moves around it as if circling a story older than the ocean itself. And a question, quiet but insistent, rises from the waves. Why does the world speak so many languages yet whisper the same legend? Giants once built what humans cannot explain. Why do cultures separated by continents, climates, and epochs describe builders too large, too powerful, too extraordinary for mortal hands? And what does humanity hope to understand when it looks upon impossible architecture? Across the Mediterranean, ancient fortifications known as Cyclopean walls still tower above the ruins of later civilizations. Their stones, some weighing dozens of tons, rest atop one another with such precision that early Greeks believed only the Cyclopes, mythic one-eyed giants, could have constructed them. This belief persisted through centuries, shaping interpretations of Bronze Age engineering. The walls seemed too large for ordinary manpower, too seamless for primitive tools, too ancient for confident explanation. Myth became the bridge between astonishment and understanding. When architecture exceeded expectation, memory invited giants into the story. When stones defy the builder, myth supplies one. The extraordinary demands extraordinary authors. Greek legend adds another layer. The Titans, primordial beings of immense power, were said to shape mountains, raise fortresses, and carve the features of the earth itself. These stories, echoed in texts influenced by the Septuagint, offer parallels to Near Eastern traditions of the mighty ones, men of renown. Although theological frameworks differ, the emotional pattern is identical. Grand structures must have grand creators. Humanity fills architectural gaps with colossal figures, because imagination must match scale. Yet this motif is not confined to Europe or the Levant. In the Americas, early explorers encountered massive pyramids, terraces, and monumental earthworks. Many indigenous traditions attributed these constructions to races of giants or powerful ancestors. Tools discovered at certain sites, too large for typical human ergonomics, fed such interpretations, whether literal or symbolic. And in Polynesia, megalithic platforms like those on Tonga or Easter Island stirred similar convictions. The stones were too heavy, the distances too great, the alignments too exact. Thus legends arose of long-vanished beings, taller and stronger than anyone living. But why does this pattern repeat across the world? Are these simply coincidences produced by universal human psychology? Or do they represent deep memory, distorted remnants of encounters with exceptional peoples or exceptional achievements? The chapter does not claim a unified origin. It instead observes a universal instinct. When confronted with architecture that exceeds present ability, cultures instinctively reach backward to beings who exceeded present size. Myth supplies proportion where knowledge fails. Archaeologically, megalithic structures do not require giants. They require organization, ingenuity, and time. But myth is not beholden to mechanics. Myth seeks meaning, and meaning often magnifies. When early peoples stood before colossal staircases carved into cliffs, or monoliths transported miles without wheels, they projected greatness backwards into antiquity. These reconstructions need not be literal to carry symbolic truth. They reveal how humanity negotiates the tension between what it sees and what it understands. Yet the persistence of giant builder traditions across cultures does raise a tantalizing possibility. Ancient societies may have preserved memories, factual or embellished, of individuals or groups whose abilities surpassed those of later generations. Whether these were exceptionally tall tribes, technologically advanced communities, or mythicized ancestors, the effect remains the same. The world feels haunted by builders who should not exist. And into this global tapestry, the biblical narratives fit uniquely. Hebrew writers did not describe giants as neutral forces of nature. They framed them within moral and theological history. Giants were not simply beings of strength. They were reminders of rebellion, judgment, and the fragility of human pride. Imagine now the world as a mosaic of forgotten foundations. Cyclopean walls in Greece, basalt terraces in Peru, stone spheres in Costa Rica, towering platforms in Polynesia. Each speaks in a dialect of silence. Each invites interpretation. Each demands a story larger than the stones themselves. And upon a distant shore, as tidewater gathers around a solitary standing stone, the world seems to whisper one lingering question. Who built the places we no longer remember? But everything changes when we step back and view the world not as a collection of isolated cultures, but as a single canvas of memory, stretched across oceans, deserts, forests, and mountains. On this canvas, giant builder legends appear not as anomalies, but as recurring strokes of the same artistic impulse. The more diverse the cultures, the more remarkable the pattern becomes. What compels a Greek mason, a Polynesian navigator, a Mayan priest, and a Levantan shepherd to tell stories of builders whose bodies and abilities exceed the human norm? Why does the myth of giants erupt spontaneously wherever monumental stonework outlives its creators? And what does this global phenomenon reveal about how humanity interprets the mysterious? In the Mediterranean, Cyclopean fortresses rise from hillsides like frozen thunder. Mycenae, Turins, and other Bronze Age sites display blocks so massive that later Greeks concluded only giants could have moved them. Their logic was simple. We could not do this, therefore those before us must have been more. The Cyclopes became the explanatory giants, beings with the power to lift what no ordinary man could. These myths did not merely fill ignorance, they honored the scale of what survived. Myth magnifies where memory fractures. Ruins demand giants when humans cannot suffice. Far across the world in the Andes, the immense terraces of Sacsayhuaman and the towering megaliths of Ollantaytambo inspired similar interpretations. Spanish chroniclers recorded indigenous claims that the structures were built by men of great stature, their strength necessary to transport stones weighing upwards of 100 tons. Modern archaeology provides mechanical explanations, ramps, rope systems, labor forces, but cannot erase the emotional impact of standing beneath stones as tall as city gates. When the conquerors themselves questioned how such feats were possible, myth rose like a protective veil around ancestral pride. In Polynesia, the same pattern unfurls across volcanic islands. The moai of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, megalithic platforms on Tonga, and navigational stones on Micronesian atolls inspired beliefs in powerful ancestors or earlier peoples who possessed supernatural strength. These island cultures knew the difficulty of moving heavy stone across treacherous terrain, and so their myths embraced builders whose capabilities exceeded normal flesh. Whether these stories reflected literal tribes of greater stature or symbolic representations of ancestral excellence, the motif remains. The greater the stone, the greater the imagined builder. Even in North America, certain ancient earthworks and stone constructions were once attributed by settlers and indigenous groups alike to the giants who lived before us, a phrase recurring in early frontier folklore. The archaeological explanation is clear. These were the achievements of complex Native American cultures, but the mythic residue remains, echoing the same logic found worldwide. When confronted by ancient works of imposing scale, imagination summons giants to fill the void of forgotten knowledge. But everything intensifies when we consider the psychological phenomenon behind these narratives. Humans interpret the distant past through the lens of the present. When confronted with ruins that exceed contemporary abilities, we project extraordinary traits onto their creators. This projection is not deception, it is reverence. It is the mind's attempt to match cause with effect. Giant stones imply giant strength. Colossal architecture implies colossal beings. This instinct appears everywhere because it is rooted in a universal human experience: awe. Yet the biblical tradition stands apart in one crucial way. While other cultures framed giants as legendary ancestors or neutral forces of creation, the Hebrew writers placed them within a moral arc. Their greatness becomes inseparable from spiritual decline. Their power becomes a caution. Their architectural legacy becomes a backdrop for divine judgment rather than cultural pride. In this view, giants are not heroes. They are reminders of what happens when strength outruns obedience. This theological framing adds depth to the global motif, positioning the biblical giants not merely as wondrous builders, but as symbols of a broken world longing for redemption. Now imagine walking through a museum of the earth, where every continent displays a fragment of impossible architecture. A stairway carved into a cliff in the Mediterranean, a monolith rising in the Pacific, a fortress wall in the Andes. None share a common culture, yet all share a common enigma. And standing before them, one cannot help but feel the same quiet astonishment that shaped ancient myth. For across the world, the stones whisper the same question: why do so many ruins seem built for hands larger than our own? And now the lens widens one final time, to view the world not as disconnected myths or scattered ruins, but as a single chorus of stone, rising from continents that never spoke to one another, yet somehow remembered the same idea. Once long ago, the builders were giants. Whether literal beings of immense stature or symbolic ancestors of exceptional strength, the motif persists with an almost stubborn universality. What does this reveal about humanity's deepest intuitions? Why do we instinctively populate the ancient world with figures larger than ourselves? And what does this global mythology tell us about the way cultures grapple with the unknown? Reese, the myths of Titans shaping the earth or Cyclopes forging the foundations of cities reflect more than fanciful storytelling. They reveal awe distilled into narrative form. When later generations encountered megalithic ruins whose scale exceeded their own engineering, myth stepped in as interpreter. Likewise, the Hebrew tradition framed its own giant figures, Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim, within a moral and theological context, tying them not to creative benevolence but to rebellion and judgment. This contrast highlights an essential truth. Even as cultures imagine giants, they imagine them differently. Giants can be creators or destroyers, ancestors or adversaries, gods or warnings. The commonality is not their nature, but the human need to explain the colossal. Where knowledge ends, myth begins. The earth keeps secrets too large for silence. In the Americas, the legends of massive builders persisted for centuries. Stories of beings who shaped mounds, carved terraces, and etched staircases up impossible cliffs. Indigenous traditions from North to South America speak of earlier races gifted with extraordinary power. Whether these figures were intended as literal giants or metaphorical ancestors of greatness, their presence in myth echoes the same instinct found in the Mediterranean and Pacific. When the architecture is too large, the hands must have been larger still. Yet even this global chorus does not erase the reality that human ingenuity alone can account for most megalithic structures. Archaeology has uncovered methods, tools, and labor strategies capable of producing stones weighing hundreds of tons. Entire communities working across generations could achieve what single individuals could not. But myth does not form because feats are impossible. It forms because they feel impossible. Myth responds to awe. Awe responds to scale. And scale, when magnified by erosion, time, and ruin, demands an origin story worthy of its stature. But everything changes when we consider the possibility that myth and memory sometimes overlap. Could early civilizations have preserved distorted recollections of exceptional individuals, leaders, warriors, or tribes, whose size or strength exceeded the average? Skeletal remains have occasionally suggested anomalously tall individuals in various regions, though not at the scale of true giants. Could these anomalies have seeded legend? Could architectural feats mastered by now-forgotten cultures have been retroactively attributed to supernatural builders? Or do these persistent stories gesture toward ancient encounters with peoples or events forever lost to history? The biblical writers, however, approached the question differently. Their narratives did not celebrate giants as cultural founders, but warned against the hubris they represented. The Hebrew scriptures situate giants within a moral tension: power without righteousness, strength without restraint, architecture without obedience. This reframing sets the biblical tradition apart from other global myths, embedding the giant builder motif into a cosmic narrative of rebellion and divine sovereignty. Thus the stones themselves, whether in Canaan, Greece, Peru, or Polynesia, become illustrations not only of ancient engineering, but of humanity's longing to interpret the impossible. Now imagine a solitary traveler standing on a remote Pacific shore. Before him rises a single monolith, weathered, silent, ancient beyond reckoning. The sea crashes behind him. Wind hums over the stone's worn surface. There is no inscription, no sign of who placed it here, no clue of its purpose. It stands alone, like a word spoken from a forgotten language. The traveler lays a hand upon its sun-warmed flank and feels only the tremor of the wind. Yet something deeper stirs, an awareness that across the world countless stones like this stand as witnesses to forgotten stories. Whether raised by giants, ancestors, or unknown cultures, they bear the same unspoken truth. Humanity has always lived in the shadow of works too great to fully understand. And as the tide rises to touch the base of the monolith, a final, unresolved image lingers. A lone standing stone on a distant shore, whispering of builders the world can no longer name. A dull metallic resonance echoes through an ancient quarry, as though some long-forgotten strike of hammer against stone still vibrates in the earth. The air is heavy with dust and memory. At the edge of the pit lies a half-cut monolith, massive, deliberate, unfinished. Its clean incisions and abandoned form suggest a story that ended too abruptly to understand. What kind of hands began this work? What strength carved the first line? And why does the world still whisper that giants shaped the earliest impossible stones? Legends across cultures describe giants lifting multi-ton blocks with ease, stones that today require cranes, pulleys, and coordinated teams of engineers. These stories portray beings who combined brute strength with uncanny precision, bridging the gap between force and craftsmanship. But were these truly accounts of literal superhuman labor? Or were later generations simply overwhelmed by the scale of structures they could no longer replicate? The mythic image of a giant hoisting a boulder becomes persuasive when the boulder itself defies explanation. Strength alone cannot make a stone fly. But stories rise where tools disappear. The Enochic tradition adds an unsettling layer. According to this ancient text non-canonical, the Watchers taught metallurgy, weapon forging, and esoteric knowledge to early humanity. Their hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, may have inherited not only immense stature but glimpses of engineering insight derived from forbidden instruction. If such teaching occurred, even symbolically, it could explain why some ancient works appear to fuse raw power with advanced technique. Yet Scripture presents the opposite emphasis. Knowledge severed from righteousness becomes corruption, not glory. Thus, giant engineering becomes morally charged. Was their construction born of ingenuity or defiance? Archaeologically, quarrying marks across the ancient world invite debate. Some stones display precision cutting suggestive of metal tools capable of fine control. Others appear torn from bedrock with brute force, as though levered from their foundations by overwhelming strength. Still others show transport routes that defy known ancient methods, massive stones moved uphill, across ravines, or along paths too narrow for large teams. Were these simply feats of coordination lost to history? Were they the result of forgotten technologies? Or did they inspire legends of beings whose strength exceeded human limits? Ancient observers, encountering such remnants, often concluded that superhuman labor must have been involved. If a single block weighed more than an entire community could lift, how else could it have been placed atop a high terrace? If a stone doorframe towered above any known building tradition, who else could have carved it? Such interpretations were not born of ignorance. They reflected a sincere attempt to match visible effect with plausible cause. When cause cannot be seen, myth supplies scale. But everything changes when we examine the engineering itself. Megalithic construction requires not only strength but planning, geometry, leverage systems, material understanding. Large stones behave predictably when moved with sledges, rollers, counterweights, and inclined planes. Many feats once attributed to giants have been replicated experimentally using human labor. Yet some anomalies remain. Clean cuts on stones too hard for bronze chisels, transportation routes with no clear engineering rationale, abandoned monoliths whose weight exceeds any known lifting method of the time. These gaps invite contemplation without forcing conclusions. The giants of tradition represent more than brute force. They symbolize a convergence of power and technique. In some cultures, they are remembered as engineers, architects, or teachers. In others, their abilities reflect the ingenuity of ancient ancestors whose accomplishments became mythologized. The more impressive the ruin, the larger the imagined builder. And within biblical framing, the giant's skill becomes a shadowed reflection of knowledge they were never meant to possess. Now picture the ancient quarry again. The half-cut stone rests in silence, its surface smooth where tools once touched. Dust gathers in lines carved with deliberate intent. One can imagine hands, massive or mortal, shaping it with purpose before something halted the work. Did a culture collapse? Did judgment interrupt the project? Did the workers flee? Or did a being of impossible stature simply walk away, never to return? As the sun sets, the unfinished monolith glows faintly, its size dwarfing everything around it. And in its heavy silence, one question persists. Who began this work, and why did they abandon it? But everything changes when we shift from legend to the stones themselves. examining not just what ancient people said about giants, but what the quarries, tool marks, and engineering puzzles reveal. The deeper one looks, the more uncanny the evidence becomes. Some feats can be explained by ingenuity, teamwork, and persistence. Others resist easy interpretation. Why do certain cuts resemble the precision of metal blades beyond the known tools of their age? Why do some monoliths appear lifted, moved, or aligned in ways that contradict expected physical limitations? And why did ancient observers, across continents, consistently attribute such achievements to beings whose stature dwarfed their own? Consider the colossal stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, blocks weighing hundreds of tons, shaped with astonishing regularity, positioned with microscopic fit. Mainstream archaeology attributes these achievements to Roman and pre-Roman engineering, yet the quarry nearby contains stones so large that even modern cranes struggle to conceptualize their movement. Legends naturally expanded. Giants built this place, locals said for centuries. But this mythology did not arise merely from imagination. It grew in the soil of overwhelming scale. The greater the stone, the greater the mystery. Engineering becomes myth when explanation collapses. In the Andes, similar enigmas appear. At Sacsayhuaman, interlocking stones fit so tightly that a blade cannot slide between them. Their faces display subtle bulges and perfect bevels. The Inca inherited these structures and added to them, but even they told stories of earlier builders possessed of superhuman strength. Their legends spoke of beings who shaped stone like clay, an image echoed across global mythology. Did they exaggerate? Certainly. Did they misremember? Possibly. But their legends reveal a psychological truth. When confronted with craftsmanship they themselves did not perform, they projected the creators backward into a more powerful age. And then there are the quarry marks, those enigmatic scars left behind when stones were extracted. At times, they show methodical cutting that aligns with known ancient tools. Other times, the marks appear inconsistent with bronze chisels, resembling pressure fractures caused by lifting forces or wedges too massive for human hands to manage efficiently. Some sites reveal stones half-dressed and abandoned abruptly, as if the labor force vanished mid-task. Why? Did famine, war, or migration interrupt the work? Or, as myth suggests, did beings of unusual capability simply disappear? But everything intensifies when we consider the idea of forbidden knowledge. The Enochic tradition describes the Watchers imparting metallurgy, enchantments, and advanced craft to humanity before the flood. If taken symbolically, these passages reflect the ancient belief that some knowledge came too early, too quickly, too forcefully. If taken literally within tradition, the giants inherited both physical power and technical skill, making them uniquely capable of monumental construction. Either interpretation highlights a thematic truth. Ancient cultures saw craftsmanship not merely as labor, but as power. Mechanical reconstructions show that even the largest stones could, in theory, be moved using wooden sledges, teams of workers, lubrication, and patience. But these theories collapse when applied to certain scenarios, such as steep inclines or extremely narrow transport paths. How, for example, were multi-ton stones hauled uphill along zigzagging mountain routes? How were they positioned with such millimeter precision? Some researchers propose ingenious, but unverified, solutions. Others suggest lost technologies, and ancient populations, lacking such speculation, simply concluded giants had done the job. This does not prove giants existed. It proves that architecture can outgrow memory. Imagine standing in an ancient quarry as the last echoes of hammer and chisel fade into the wind. All that remains is an unfinished monolith, partially severed from bedrock, edges clean, surface smooth where some tool carved through. The ground around it is flattened as though prepared for labor, but no artifacts remain, no tools, no explanation, only the undeniable fact that someone began this work with vision and effort powerful enough to shape mountainsides. Ancient observers, encountering such sights long after the builders had vanished, would have filled in the missing story with the largest characters they knew. Giants, mighty ones, beings capable of reshaping stone as though it were pliable. The quarry now lies silent, but the monolith still waits, immense, unfinished, inscrutable. And in that silence rises one question the earth refuses to answer. Who walked away from this work, and why did they never return? And now the narrative descends into the heart of the mystery, not merely what giants might have done, but what the stones themselves imply about those who shaped them. Across continents and centuries, construction feats exceed the expectations of their cultures. Massive stones lifted without cranes, perfect cuts achieved without iron tools, monoliths transported across distances that challenge modern logistics. Whether these achievements were the work of giants, of forgotten engineers, or of human communities whose capacities we underestimate, the effect is the same. The ancient world appears to have operated on a scale we can barely fathom. What then does this say about the builders? What kind of strength, physical, intellectual, or mythic, lies behind these enduring enigmas? Tradition answers with the language of giants, strength beyond measure, hands capable of hoisting boulders like pebbles, bodies that towered above common men. But ancient descriptions offer more than brute force, they imply technique. Legends of the Nephilim speak of knowledge inherited from the Watchers, knowledge Scripture frames not as blessing but corruption. Metallurgy, weaponry, enchantments, astronomical insight, skills that could alter both environment and society. If these myths reflect even fragments of historical memory, they suggest that some early builders possessed unusual advantages, whether physical or technological. Were these literal beings of great stature, or cultures whose learning was later mythologized into size? The line between myth and memory blurs like dust drifting across an abandoned quarry. Power alone cannot shape a civilization. Knowledge without wisdom becomes ruin. Scientific reconstruction often shows how megalithic feats could be achieved by coordinated human labor. Ramps, levers, sledges, rollers, and counterweights allow the physical movement of colossal blocks. But these explanations do not diminish the psychological question. Why did ancient societies return, again and again, to the idea that giants, but not ordinary humans, performed such tasks? Why do so many traditions insist that earlier ages possessed strength or knowledge lost to later generations? When collective memory encounters ruins that overshadow current capacity, it instinctively enlarges the builders to match the stones. Yet some mysteries stubbornly resist convenient explanation. At several quarries, stones were abandoned mid-extraction, not small blocks but monoliths weighing hundreds of tons. Tool marks fade abruptly, as though the workforce disappeared instantaneously. In other places, stones lie half-carved, shapes emerging from bedrock only to pause forever unfinished. What halted the work? Famine, war, and migration offer plausible answers, yet something about the suddenness unsettles the imagination. When ruins appear interrupted, the mind asks what interrupted them. But everything intensifies when we consider the symbolic meaning behind these engineering puzzles. The giants of ancient tradition often represent the tragic blend of power and disobedience, beings capable of reshaping landscapes yet incapable of preventing their own downfall. Their abandoned works become metaphors for the collapse of civilizations that trusted strength more than wisdom. In this sense, the half-cut stone in the quarry is not merely a physical puzzle, it is a spiritual one. It symbolizes ambition halted by judgment, genius consumed by corruption, capacity left unfinished because its foundation was flawed. Still, the allure of literal giants endures because certain marks on the earth resist demystification. Some cuts appear too smooth for bronze chisels. Some blocks seem too heavy for timber-based leverage. Some alignments demand astronomical knowledge generations ahead of their time. While none of these prove the involvement of superhuman builders, they do provoke humility, reminding us that the ancient world contains chapters of ingenuity we have not yet rediscovered. Now picture the quarry one final time. Light fades across the half-cut monolith, its surface glowing faintly as the sky deepens into violet. The stone lies tilted in its cradle of bedrock, edges crisp, center unfinished. Around it, the ground bears faint depressions where workers or giants once stood. The abandoned block seems like the beginning of a sentence never completed, a monument to an intention interrupted. Wind drifts through the quarry, stirring small clouds of dust. The world has moved on. The builders, whoever they were, have vanished. Yet the stone remains vast, inert, stubbornly silent. And in that silence, the final unresolved question rises like a breath held too long. Who began this work, and why did they abandon it to time? A storm broods over the ancient world, thick clouds rolling like a dark ceiling pulled tight across the sky. Beneath them, the last great strongholds of the Nephilim rise from the earth, massive, imposing, unshaken by time or war. Their stones gleam like the armor of titans. Their gates tower over the plains. But even the strongest fortress cannot silence the whisper carried on the wind. Judgment is coming. What happens when those who build for domination confront the one who builds for redemption? What becomes of structures raised in defiance when the architect of the world draws near? And can strength, however vast, shield a being from the consequences of its own corruption? Genesis speaks of a divine decree that predated the flood. The end of all flesh has come before me, announcing not destruction for its own sake, but judgment upon violence that had filled the earth. The giants, mighty though they were, could not outmuscle a storm birthed by divine command. Their cities, if they had any, crumbled beneath waters that erased the pride of an entire generation. Strength failed, stone failed, ambition drowned. The deluge proved a truth older than the world itself. Foundations built without righteousness fracture when judgment falls. Power shatters when purpose decays. No wall is higher than judgment. Yet the story did not end with the flood. In the centuries that followed, a second wave of giant clans emerged: Anakim, Rephaim, Zamzummim, tribes whose presence loomed over the hills of Canaan. Their strongholds rose like challenges carved into the landscape. Fortified cities bristled with impossible walls. Travelers spoke of warriors whose shadows stretched twice the length of ordinary men. And Israel, newly formed and fearful, stood before these giants asking the same ancient question: how can the weak prevail against the mighty? The answer threaded quietly through Scripture: giants fall not because of inferior strength, but because of corrupted purpose. Israel's campaigns against the Rephaim and Anakim were framed not as conquests of human strategy, but as divine acts of justice. Time and again, biblical writers emphasized that the giants' downfall flowed from moral decay, not military inadequacy. Their cities became cautionary symbols, reminders that dominance without humility ends in ruin. Even Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed symbolized his imposing stature, could not preserve his kingdom when judgment approached. But everything changes when we compare the giants' architecture with their fate. Their walls were thick, their gates towering, their citadels engineered for fear. Yet these very structures became the stages of their collapse. When Israel encircled Jericho, a city some traditions associate with giant-like inhabitants, the walls fell not through strength but through obedience to divine command. When Joshua's armies confronted the fortified cities of the Anakim, Scripture records decisive victories not because Israel became stronger, but because the giants' protection no longer shielded them. What does it mean when colossal architecture, designed to intimidate, becomes fragile under divine scrutiny? And how does a world built by rebels crumble so quickly when justice arrives? For ancient storytellers, the fall of giant cities became moral geography. The ruins scattered across the land served not as tributes to Nephilim greatness, but as warnings to future generations. Stone remembers rebellion differently than it remembers obedience. A monument raised without righteousness is destined for fracture, erosion, collapse. And giant cities, despite their scale, left behind broken towers, fallen gates, and fields littered with shattered masonry. These remnants did not glorify the builders, they testified against them. Imagine a battlefield after the conquest of a giant inhabited region. The sun sets behind collapsing walls, casting jagged shadows across the plain. Stones that once formed a fortress now lie scattered like the bones of a fallen creature. A lone Israelite soldier walks through the rubble, touching a block so large it dwarfs him. He wonders what kind of strength once lifted it, what kind of hands shaped it, and why such strength could not preserve its owners. He lifts his gaze toward the silent ruins, and the air seems to whisper a truth older than all kingdoms. Strength without obedience becomes its own undoing. But everything changes when we shift from the giant cities to the giants themselves, when the narrative stops admiring the architecture and begins examining the foundations beneath it. The Nephilim and their post-flood descendants raised walls, gates, citadels, and monuments that seemed unbreakable. Yet every structure, no matter how massive, stood upon a moral fault line. Their strength could lift stones, command armies, and intimidate nations, but it could not shield them from the consequences of rebellion. How does a being so powerful fall so completely? How does a fortress so imposing collapse so suddenly? And what does the ruin of the giants reveal about the hidden fragility of unchecked dominion? The biblical record presents the giants not merely as physical threats, but as symbols of a world out of alignment with its creator. In Genesis, their violence contributes to the earth's corruption, hastening divine judgment. The flood becomes not random catastrophe but targeted cleansing, erasing the architectures of rebellion regardless of scale. The waters lifted neither city nor builder. Everything raised in defiance sank beneath the weight of its own arrogance. Even the most formidable structures cracked under the pressure of cosmic justice. Judgment respects no engineering. Height cannot outgrow consequence. After the flood, the pattern repeats. Israel encounters giant clans whose settlements exhibit remarkable strength, places fortified to intimidate. The spies sent by Moses describe the Anakim as towering figures living in cities walled up to heaven, language that captures the psychological dominance these structures projected. The giants built for fear. They built to be seen. They built to remain unchallenged. Yet the God of Israel did not measure strength by stone. The collapse of these strongholds would become demonstrations of moral reversal. The mighty humbled, the weak upheld. Consider the campaign against Og, king of Bashan. His reputation alone could paralyze armies. His bed, whether literal or symbolic, represented power beyond ordinary human measure. His cities formed a bulwark across the northern frontier of Canaan. And still, his downfall came not through siege machines or overwhelming numbers, but through divine decree. When judgment arrived, Og's strength meant nothing. His city walls meant nothing. His authority meant nothing. His structures, once symbols of enduring power, became monuments to impermanence. The fall of Jericho illustrates this same theme through a different narrative lens. Though Jericho is not explicitly tied to giants in the biblical text, later traditions imagined its inhabitants as unusually formidable, perhaps reflecting broader Canaanite fear motifs. Regardless, its collapse through divine intervention reinforced a truth the giants themselves had ignored. Obedience can topple what force cannot. Israel's victory came not by superior engineering, but through trust, ritual, and timing. elements utterly foreign to the architectural mindset of domination. But everything intensifies when we observe that giant cities tended to fall not through gradual erosion, but through decisive rupture. Walls broke, gates shattered, entire fortifications collapsed under what later generations described as acts of God. If the giants built to secure their future, their constructions ironically became memorials of their downfall. Each ruin crystallized the same lesson: strength without righteousness is brittle. Ancient peoples walking among these ruins would have absorbed this message instinctively. They saw shattered towers and remembered the mighty ones who once ruled. They stepped over broken gates and recalled warnings passed down through generations. Do not build against the divine. Cities that once embodied intimidation became geography lessons in humility. Imagine now a battlefield after Israel's encounter with a giant inhabited region. Smoke lingers in the air. The ground is littered with fragments of stone too large to be placed by ordinary hands. Where once stood an unbreachable fortress, now only wreckage remains. A soldier moves slowly among the ruins, picking up a shard of masonry carved with symbols he cannot decipher. This was someone's world, someone's hope of permanence, yet it lies in rubble. He looks toward the horizon, where the sunlight catches the toppled remains of a giant battlement. It once cast a long shadow over the valley. Now it lies fractured, powerless. And the desolate wind seems to whisper a simple truth: the greatest structures cannot protect those who stand against the purposes of God. And now the story narrows to its final tension. The moment when the giant's world, propped up by vast strength and towering architecture, encounters the one force it cannot resist: divine judgment. For all their might, the giants could not outrun the decree spoken in Genesis, nor could their descendants withstand the unraveling of their strongholds under Israel's advance. What does this reveal about power misaligned with purpose? What does it teach about civilizations that build higher walls instead of deeper foundations? And why do their ruins, scattered across the earth, feel like graves for ambitions that grew greater than their wisdom? The collapse of the Nephilim builders begins not with a battle, but with a verdict. The flood, described in terse biblical poetry, functions as a cosmic reversal. The giants who shaped the pre-flood earth with force and grandeur found their work swallowed by waters that answered to no mortal command. They were beings capable of lifting colossal stones, yet powerless against judgment delivered through something as soft as rain. Their strength had reshaped valleys. Their presence had intimidated nations. Yet a single divine act erased their world. The message becomes unmistakable. Power detached from righteousness is not merely fragile, it is doomed. Judgment is the great leveler of giants. The higher the wall, the farther it falls. After the flood, the pattern repeats with haunting consistency. The Anakim, Rephaim, and other giant clans reestablish themselves in fortified cities across Canaan. They build with confidence. They reign with stability. Their walls intimidate. Their warriors tower. Their cities become symbols of permanence. But permanence cannot be constructed with stone alone. It requires alignment with the order of the one who governs history. And when Israel enters the land, carrying not superior strength but divine mandate, the giant's dominion fractures. The biblical battle narratives reveal a profound reversal. Israel, the smaller, weaker nation, prevails not through military advantage but through obedience. The giants, despite physical superiority, fall because their story no longer aligns with the movement of redemption. Their architecture becomes their undoing. Towering walls collapse, gates splinter, fortresses crumble. Not because human force overpowered them, but because divine purpose bypassed the logic of strength. The moral arc bends, and the mighty are cast down. But everything sharpens when we consider the aftermath of these collapses. The ruins left behind by giant inhabited cities become more than archaeological remnants. They become moral landmarks. Scattered blocks of megalithic stone whisper warnings to future generations. Do not mistake size for security. Do not confuse strength with stability. Do not build kingdoms on pride. The ruins testify that rebellion, no matter how fortified, carries the seeds of its own destruction. In this sense, the downfall of the giant builders becomes a parable carved into the terrain of the ancient Near East. The geography of Canaan becomes a gallery of fallen strongholds, each one a visual sermon, a reminder that dominance without obedience cannot endure. Even Israel, centuries later, would face judgment when its own foundations shifted toward corruption. The giants were not the only ones to fall. Their ruins stood as mirrors, warning every nation that no structure can stand apart from righteousness. But perhaps the most haunting image emerges from the battlefield itself. Imagine walking through the shattered remains of a giant fortress shortly after its fall. The stones lie scattered like broken teeth across the earth. A once imposing gate, designed to intimidate, now slumps sideways in defeat. The air holds the faint scent of dust and smoke, and amid the ruins lies a colossal shield, too large for any ordinary warrior, split down the center as though struck by something far greater than human force. An Israelite soldier pauses before the broken shield. He runs his hand along its jagged edge, feeling the cold metal where a giant once gripped it. The silence around him is immense. It is the silence of finality, the end of a story built on strength without submission. He lifts his gaze to the shattered walls. They once stood as symbols of invincibility. Now they crumble, whispering the truth the giants refuse to hear. For even the greatest builders cannot outbuild judgment. And as wind whistles through the ruins, a final unresolved image remains. Shattered walls strewn across a battlefield, telling a story of strength that destroyed itself. Twilight settles over a field of ancient stones, each one casting a long, thin shadow across the earth like the memory of a world that refused to die. The builders are gone, dust, legend, whisper, and yet their monuments endure, shaping the imagination of every generation that stumbles upon them. Why do these silent colossi continue to speak? Why does the human spirit return again and again to stories of giants, as though searching for something hidden in their downfall? And what hunger in the heart keeps resurrecting beings whose legacy is etched in both awe and warning? Human fascination with giants is not merely about size. It is about significance. Giants represent the tension between strength and purpose, between what we can build and what we should build. Their ruins remind us that endurance in stone does not guarantee meaning in history. A wall can outlive a kingdom. A monolith can outlast its maker, but survival alone is not triumph. The giants teach this without uttering a word. Some warnings survive longer than their authors. Stone remembers what pride forgets. Psalmic reflections whisper the same truth in softer tones. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Whether the giants shaped literal structures or symbolic ones, their downfall illustrates this biblical principle with stark clarity. Their strength could lift mountains, but it could not lift judgment. Their architecture could endure centuries, but it could not secure righteousness. Their names could echo through legend, but they could not claim the purpose that sustains creation. Scripture recenters every story, including theirs, on the true architect, the one whose designs cannot crumble because they are rooted in justice, humility, and divine order. Yet mystery continues to cling to the giants. Modern imaginations thrill at the possibility of lost civilizations, hidden technologies, forgotten ages where beings of immense stature walked the earth. Books, documentaries, and speculative theories resurrect the Nephilim with a fervor that defies the boundaries of scholarship. Why? Because giants offer a mythic mirror, reflecting our longing to believe humanity once brushed against something extraordinary, and our fear that power can destroy even those who wield it. Tell me your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? The persistence of giant stories across cultures reveals not only curiosity about the past, but anxiety about the present. We sense the thin line between wonder and hubris, between creation and corruption, between stretching upward and toppling under our own weight. The Nephilim become symbols of what happens when ambition outruns obedience. Their ruins are sermons without preachers, monuments without inscriptions, parables without verses. They stand in twilight to remind us that the world itself keeps score. And still the stones endure. They endure as metaphors for spiritual lessons. Strength without wisdom collapses, power without humility destroys, architecture without purpose becomes tomb instead of testimony. They endure as archaeological puzzles, inviting further excavation, further debate, further awe. They endure as emotional landmarks, touchstones for the imagination, connecting the modern world to the mythic past. They endure because they speak a truth too large to ignore. Humanity is always building something, and what we build reveals what we worship. Now imagine a traveler arriving at dusk in a forgotten valley. Before him rise ancient stones arranged in patterns he cannot decipher. Their edges gleam faintly, catching the last rays of the dying sun. He feels small, smaller than he ever has, not because the stones are tall, but because they remind him that every generation builds monuments, yet only a few endure with meaning. He wonders about the hands that raised them. He wonders why they fell. The sky deepens into indigo. The stones lengthen their shadows across the earth. It is impossible to tell where the past ends and the lesson begins. And as the traveler stands there in silence, one question lingers like the final breath of daylight. In the structures we build today, our cities, our systems, our ambitions, whose legacy are we truly continuing? But everything changes when we step back and realize that the story of the giants is not really about their height or their strength. It is about the human heart. Across ages and civilizations, the tales of the Nephilim endure not because people long to meet giants, but because people long to understand power. Why does power seduce? Why does it destroy? Why does it promise permanence and deliver collapse? These questions lie at the center of every myth, every ruin, every whispered legend of beings who once shaped landscapes with their hands and then vanished beneath the weight of their own rebellion. The stones that remain, dolmens, monoliths, terraces, Cyclopean walls, become mirrors. In them we glimpse our own ambitions reflected at colossal scale. We marvel at what early peoples accomplished. We wonder how much of their ruin was engineered by their pride. The Bible frames this contrast with piercing clarity. Psalms and prophetic writings insist that greatness rooted in self-exaltation is doomed, while greatness rooted in humility becomes endurance. The giants became cautionary figures not because of their size, but because their stories illustrated an ancient truth. Strength without surrender corrodes from within. Every ruin is a reminder. Every monument hides a motive. Modern fascination with lost civilizations, lost technologies, and lost races reveals a deeper spiritual thirst. Humanity longs to believe the world once held secrets worth recovering. We study the pyramids, Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, the Nazca lines, the dolmens of Bashan, half hoping that giants built them, half fearing what it means if ordinary humans did. If ordinary hands accomplished such feats, then modern humanity has forgotten something profound. If giants accomplished them, then history is far stranger than textbooks allow. Either scenario unsettles the present, forcing us to ask what we have lost or what we have ignored. But everything intensifies when we consider the symbolic function of giants as boundary markers in Scripture. They appear at thresholds, before the flood, before Israel enters the land, before major transitions in biblical history. They are not the main story, they are the shadows cast by it. Their defeat makes room for covenant. Their downfall reveals the fragility of pride. Their ruins frame the rise of nations built not on physical height, but on obedience. Thus, the giants become narrative guardians of a moral truth. Kingdoms rise by strength, but they are established by righteousness. The modern world, however, often repeats the ancient pattern. We build taller towers, larger empires, more ambitious systems, believing height equates to stability, scale equates to permanence, visibility equates to meaning. Yet the ruins of the giants warn that architecture built on ego, even when it stands for centuries, can become a monument to folly rather than greatness. The Nephilim remind us that power alone cannot sustain purpose. Technology cannot secure wisdom. Strength cannot substitute for moral grounding. Imagine standing once again in the valley of ancient stones. But this time the stones seem to ask a different question, not about the past, but about the future. What are we building? Towers of steel, cities of glass, digital empires, cultural monuments, economic fortresses, the giants built to be unchallenged. Do we build for the same reason or for something nobler? The stones endure not to glorify the giants, but to warn us that endurance without virtue is empty. They teach that permanence is not found in stone, but in alignment with divine purpose. They teach that power is not the enemy, but power without humility is. They teach that fallen worlds, ancient or modern, crumble from the inside before they collapse from the outside. As twilight deepens, the traveler from Part 1 returns to the ancient field. He runs his hand along a monolith's rough surface. It is colder now. The shadow it casts is longer. He feels a quiet question rising from the earth beneath his feet, one that does not accuse but invites. And in that quiet, the stones seem to whisper, "What will you build, and what will remain when you're gone?" And now the final image forms, not of giants lifting stones, nor of cities rising in defiance, but of humanity standing before the silent architecture of its own making. The story of the Nephilim is no longer about ancient beings lost to the earth. It becomes a parable about us. Our strength may differ from theirs, but our ambitions pulse with the same fire. We seek permanence. We seek legacy. We seek to shape the earth in ways that will outlast us. But what happens when our ambition runs faster than our humility? What becomes of our monuments if their foundations lack wisdom? And when the future stands where we now stand, what will our own ruins say? Across the world, stones raised thousands of years ago still stand like moral silhouettes. They endure when their builders do not. They remind us that the value of architecture is not measured only in mass, but in motive. A colossal wall may survive erosion, but if it was built from pride, its endurance testifies not to brilliance but to blindness. A tiny altar built from obedience carries more meaning than a fortress built from arrogance. Scripture repeats this truth gently but firmly. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor build in vain. Legacy is not the shadow we cast, but the light we follow. Endurance without purpose is just a longer fall. The ruins of the giants become mirrors held to our generation. We marvel at their lost world, but our own world creates its own giants, not in stature but in influence, not lifting stones but shaping nations, not carving megaliths but constructing global systems whose weight can crush or sustain millions. The ancient giants warn us that power without humility becomes catastrophe, and catastrophe leaves behind ruins that preach louder than any living voice. Their downfall is not distant myth. It is a lesson replayed in every century of human history. But everything changes when we recognize that Scripture does not leave the story there, in ruin, collapse, and warning. The biblical narrative consistently redirects attention away from the giants and toward the one who outlasts them. God is portrayed not as an architect of stone, but as an architect of hearts. His structures are justice, mercy, humility, obedience. These are the materials that cannot erode. These are the walls that cannot fall. These are the foundations that remain even when civilizations fragment into dust. This is the quiet reversal at the core of the giant builder narrative. The giants built big. God builds deep. The giants built wide. God builds eternal. The giants built to intimidate. God builds to redeem. Imagine now the traveler who has wandered through the ruins all day. As night descends, he climbs a small rise above the ancient stones. Moonlight pools over the landscape, turning each monolith into a pale silhouette, like a congregation gathered in silent contemplation. To him, they no longer look like the works of titans, but like questions carved into the earth. Questions about power, questions about pride, questions about purpose. He remembers the stories of giants who walked before the flood, whose strength could move mountains yet could not save them. He recalls the fortified cities of the post-flood giants, whose walls could repel armies yet collapsed when their purpose misaligned with God. He thinks of the modern world, its skyscrapers and networks and ambitions, all taller than anything the giants ever built, yet equally vulnerable if their foundations are corrupt. And as he stands beneath the glowing sky, one final truth dawns upon him. The legacy of the giants is not a celebration of fallen power, but a reminder of enduring principles. Their ruins whisper warnings, but also wisdom. They tell us that greatness without righteousness is empty. They tell us that ambition without humility is perilous. They tell us that architecture without true purpose becomes rubble under time's patient hand. The traveler descends the hill slowly, leaving the stones behind. But their shadows follow him, stretching long across the night. And as the world grows quiet, one question lingers like the last echo of a forgotten age. In the architectures we build today, empires, dreams, identities, whose legacy are we truly continuing? Night settles over the ancient world once more. And the stones, those last remaining witnesses of forgotten ages, rest beneath a sky unchanged by time. The giants have vanished. Their cities have crumbled. Their stories have thinned into whispers carried by wind and memory. Yet something in their rise and fall endures, something we cannot quite touch but cannot ignore. For their legacy is not written in their height, nor in the vast reach of their hands, but in the echoes they left behind, echoes that hum quietly beneath our own ambitions. Power misused leaves ruins. Strength without purpose leaves shadows. Architecture without wisdom leaves warnings instead of wonders. Perhaps that is why we return to these stories again and again, not to resurrect the giants but to understand ourselves. Humanity, like the Nephilim, builds. We lift our own monuments. We chase our own visions of permanence. But the ruins remind us that meaning does not live in stone. It lives in the heart, in humility, in alignment with the one who builds eternally. So as the final embers of this story fade into the hush of the night, let the stones speak one last time, not as relics of a darker world, but as guides pointing toward a wiser one. Sleep now beneath the quiet of ages. And when you rise, rise with purpose deeper than any monument, and foundations stronger than any giant could have built.